Hey everyone. Tonight we're traveling back to ancient Greece, to the powerful city of Thebes, where a king and queen received a prophecy so terrible that they tried to prevent it from ever coming true. But in Greek mythology, escaping fate was rarely so simple. Tonight we begin the complete story of Oedipus, the king who spent his entire life running from a destiny he never understood. Long before Oedipus became the famous king of Thebes, before he stood before the mysterious Sphinx, before the people of an entire city celebrated his name, and long before he discovered the terrible truth hidden beneath his own past, there lived in Thebes a king named Laius and his queen Jocasta. Their city was old, even by the standards of ancient Greece, surrounded by strong walls, and connected in legend with gods, warriors, royal families, and generations of stories that had been repeated beside fires for centuries. From the palace of Thebes, Laius ruled over a kingdom that appeared secure. He possessed authority, wealth, servants, soldiers, and everything expected of a king. Yet inside the royal household, there was one absence that neither power nor wealth could easily solve. Laius and Jocasta had no child. For an ordinary family, this could bring private sadness. For a royal family, however, the question carried another weight. A kingdom expected continuity. A king would eventually die, and someone would need to inherit his throne. Without an heir, uncertainty waited quietly beyond Laius's reign. And so, as rulers and ordinary people often did in the world of Greek myth, Laius looked toward the gods for an answer. He sought knowledge from the divine world, hoping perhaps to learn whether a son would eventually be born to him. But the answer he received was not the reassurance he wanted. According to the tradition, preserved most famously in the story of Oedipus, Laius was warned that if he fathered a son, that son would one day kill him. In some versions, the prophecy carried an even darker continuation. The child would eventually marry his own mother. The future Laius had hoped to secure suddenly appeared more frightening than having no heir at all. A son was no longer simply a child who might continue his family. He had become, before even being born, the figure standing at the end of his father's life. This is where the tragedy of Oedipus truly begins, not with Oedipus himself, but with an adult, hearing something about the future and becoming so afraid of it that every decision afterward is shaped by the attempt to escape it. Greek mythology returns to this idea again and again. Cronus hears that one of his children will overthrow him, and his fear leads him to swallow them. Acrisius learns that his daughter Danae will have a son who will cause his death, and his attempts to prevent that future eventually help bring Perseus into the circumstances through which the prophecy is fulfilled. The pattern is almost cruelly consistent. A prophecy does not merely describe the future. Once heard, it changes the behavior of the people trying to prevent it. Laius now lived beneath that shadow. Every thought of fatherhood carried the memory of what had been foretold. Perhaps he believed that the safest answer was simply never to have a son. If the child described by the oracle was never born, then surely the prophecy would have nowhere to go. Yet, myths rarely allow human beings such clean solutions. Eventually, Jocasta gave birth to a baby boy. For a brief moment, before prophecy and fear reclaimed the room, there must have been only the ordinary vulnerability of a newborn child. He knew nothing of Thebes. He knew nothing of kingship. He knew nothing of Apollo, oracles, curses, crossroads, or fate. He could not understand why adults might look at him with terror. He had committed no crime. He had made no decision. Yet, before he was old enough to recognize his father's face, a story had already been written around him. Laius remembered the warning. Somewhere in that tiny child, the king believed, was the man who would eventually kill him, and fear transformed the meaning of everything before him. Where Jocasta might see a son, Laius could see a future murderer. Where another father might imagine teaching the boy to walk, speak, ride, hunt, or eventually rule, Laius could imagine only the final moment promised by the prophecy. The tragedy is that the child himself remained completely innocent. The future crimes associated with his name had not happened. He possessed no intention to harm anyone. Yet Laius decided that the prophecy could be defeated only if the child never lived long enough to fulfill it. And so, a terrible plan was made. The baby would be removed from Thebes and abandoned somewhere far from the palace. In the most familiar versions of the myth, the infant's ankles or feet were pierced or bound together before he was given to a servant or shepherd to be exposed on the mountainside. This detail would later become connected with his name, Oedipus, traditionally interpreted as referring to his swollen feet. The mark created when adults tried to erase his future would remain upon his body as evidence of a past he himself would not remember. There is a bitter irony in that. Laius wanted to remove every connection between the child and Thebes, but the very act intended to destroy him created one of the clues that would someday help reveal who he truly was. The infant was taken away from the palace. No trumpet announced his departure. No people gathered to watch. The heir to Thebes left his father's kingdom not in a royal procession, but in the arms of someone ordered to make sure he never returned. Beyond the city stretched the landscapes of ancient Greece. Rocky paths, hills, valleys, forests, grazing land, and mountains that could become dangerous places after sunset. One of those mountains, Mount Cithaeron, became associated with the abandonment of Oedipus. To the people of the ancient world, exposing an infant in such a place meant leaving the child's survival to chance, the gods, or death. The baby could not protect himself. He could not crawl home. He could not tell anyone his name because he did not yet possess one he understood. He could only cry and depend upon whoever carried him. The servant entrusted with the task now faced a choice. Orders from a king were not suggestions. Disobeying could bring serious consequences. Yet carrying an innocent child toward death was something different from carrying out an ordinary royal command. The servant looked at the boy and apparently could not bring himself to complete the task as intended. Instead of simply leaving the infant to die, he passed him into the care of another shepherd, one connected with the neighboring kingdom of Corinth. That moment, quiet, small, and almost invisible compared with everything that would happen later, changed the history of two royal houses. Laius believed his son was gone, and because he survived, he would grow up somewhere else without knowing that anyone had ever tried to kill him. The shepherd carried the infant away from the mountains and eventually brought him toward Corinth, where King Polybus and Queen Merope ruled. Unlike Laius and Jocasta, Polybus and Merope had long desired a child, but had none of their own in the traditional version of the story. And suddenly, through a chain of decisions none of them had planned, a baby appeared. To Laius, this child had represented danger. To the royal couple of Corinth, he represented something entirely different, an answer to an absence that had existed in their household for years. They accepted him and raised him as their son, and so the child who had been sent away from one palace entered another. This is one of the most important facts in the entire myth, because Oedipus did not grow up believing he was an abandoned child. He did not spend his childhood searching for his biological parents. As far as he understood, Polybus and Merope were his father and mother. Corinth was home, its palace was his palace, its people were the people he might one day rule. The royal couple apparently did not tell him the truth of his origins, perhaps because they wanted him to feel completely their own, perhaps because the circumstances were painful, or perhaps simply because myths require certain truths to remain hidden until the moment they can cause the greatest change. Whatever the reason, Oedipus grew up inside a false certainty, and false certainty is often more dangerous than uncertainty, because a person does not know there is anything to question. Imagine Oedipus as a young boy walking through the palace at Corinth. Servants bow because he is the prince. Teachers instruct him because he is expected to become an educated nobleman. He sees Polybus at the head of the household and knows him as father. He sees Merope and knows her as mother. Nobody tells him that another king once looked at his newborn face and saw death. Nobody tells him that his feet carry the memory of an order issued in Thebes. Nobody tells him that somewhere beyond the roads surrounding Corinth lives a woman who gave birth to him and believes him dead. To Oedipus, life begins in Corinth because memory begins there. Everything before it belongs to other people. Yet, fate in Greek mythology does not require its victims to understand it. Years passed. The abandoned infant became a boy, and the boy became a young man. Oedipus grew intelligent, confident, and physically capable. Later events would show that he possessed a mind capable of solving problems that defeated others, but also a temperament that could become fierce when challenged. None of these qualities seemed unusual enough to reveal the truth of his birth. He was simply the Prince of Corinth, growing toward adulthood. Polybus and Merope loved him, and Oedipus loved them. That love is essential to understanding what happens next. Without it, his later decision makes little sense. Oedipus would eventually run away from Corinth, not because he rejected his parents, but because he loved them so deeply that he believed leaving was the only way to protect them. The tragedy is that the people he would be trying to protect were not the people named by the prophecy. But Oedipus did not know that yet. For years, the secret remained undisturbed. Perhaps Polybus and Merope began to believe it would remain hidden forever. The shepherd who had brought the child might have become an old man. Laius and Jocasta in Thebes believed their son had died on Mount Cithaeron. Every adult who knew part of the truth had a reason not to speak. And Oedipus himself had no reason to ask. Then, during a gathering or banquet according to familiar versions of the story, someone said something that shattered the certainty upon which Oedipus's identity had been built. A man who had been drinking accused him of not truly being the son of Polybus. Perhaps the words were intended merely as an insult. Perhaps the speaker had heard a rumor circulating quietly around Corinth. The exact circumstances vary across retellings, but the effect upon Oedipus was profound. A person can ignore an insult when it attacks something he already knows to be false. This one touched a question Oedipus had never considered. He confronted Polybus and Merope. They reassured him. They denied that there was any reason for him to doubt his place in their family. And perhaps for a little while their reassurance worked, but once uncertainty enters the mind, it rarely leaves simply because someone asks it to. Oedipus began looking backward through his life for evidence. Perhaps he thought about his appearance. Perhaps he remembered moments that had once seemed insignificant. We should not invent details the ancient sources do not give us. But we can understand the basic human response. When someone tells you that the story of your own life may not be true, suddenly every memory becomes available for reinterpretation. Oedipus wanted certainty. And in ancient Greek mythology, when mortals desperately wanted answers about things beyond ordinary knowledge, there was one place famous above almost all others: Delphi. There, at the sanctuary of Apollo, the oracle was believed to communicate divine knowledge through the Pythia. Kings consulted Delphi before wars. Colonists sought guidance before journeys. Individuals came with questions about family, duty, illness, and the future. Oedipus decided to travel there. Perhaps he expected a simple answer. Are Polybus and Merope truly my parents? If the oracle confirmed it, the drunken accusation could be forgotten. Oedipus could return to Corinth, apologize for his doubts, and continue the life he had always expected. But Greek oracles rarely answered questions in the simple way mortals wanted. Oedipus arrived at Delphi seeking information about his past. Instead, he was confronted with a terrifying vision of his future. The oracle did not give him the reassurance he wanted. According to the famous tradition, Oedipus learned that he was destined to kill his father and marry his mother. Imagine receiving those words without knowing the secret of your birth. Oedipus had only one father, Polybus. He had only one mother, Merope. Therefore, the meaning seemed obvious. If he returned to Corinth, one day he would kill the man who had raised him and marry the woman who had loved him as her son. The thought was unbearable. Oedipus did not know that the prophecy referred to Laius and Jocasta. He did not know that the very information required to interpret the oracle correctly had been hidden from him since infancy, and so he made what seemed, from his limited knowledge, like the most loving and responsible decision available. He would never return home. If fate said he would kill his father, then he would stay far away from Polybus. If fate said he would marry his mother, then he would never again go near Merope. Distance would become his defense against destiny. Perhaps Polybus and Merope waited for him to return from Delphi. Perhaps they expected to see him walking through the palace gates after a few days or weeks. Instead, Oedipus turned away from Corinth. He chose exile without saying goodbye properly, because in his mind, every kilometre between himself and his parents made them safer. There is something deeply sad about this decision, because it was motivated by love. Oedipus was not running because he wanted freedom from his family. He was sacrificing the life he knew to protect them. If he had been selfish, he might have returned and ignored the prophecy. Instead, he abandoned his inheritance, his palace, his parents, and everything familiar, because he believed his presence could destroy the people he loved. But fate had prepared its cruelest irony. Every step Oedipus took away from Corinth carried him farther from the two people he could never fulfill the prophecy against. And every step carried him closer to Thebes. The road stretched before him beneath the Greek sun, winding between mountains and valleys, splitting at places where travelers had to choose one direction or another. Oedipus walked alone, believing that he had escaped the future by leaving home behind. Somewhere ahead of him, another traveler was approaching along the same road. An older man rode with attendants, accustomed to being obeyed, traveling through the narrow landscape with the authority of someone important. Oedipus had never seen him before. He did not know his name. He did not know where he came from. He certainly did not know that years earlier this man had ordered a newborn child taken into the mountains and left to die. The two travelers moved closer to one another until, near a place where several roads met, there was no longer enough room for both journeys to continue peacefully. Oedipus had left Corinth to make certain he would never kill his father, and at the crossroads ahead, without recognizing either face, father and son were about to meet. Oedipus walked away from Corinth believing that every step was an act of protection, because somewhere behind him were Polybus and Merope, the only parents he had ever known, and somewhere ahead was a life he had not chosen but was willing to accept if it meant keeping them safe. He had gone to Delphi hoping to discover the truth about his birth. But instead, the oracle had given him something far more frightening: the prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. To Oedipus, there seemed to be only one reasonable response. He would put as much distance as possible between himself and Corinth. He would surrender his position as prince, abandon the palace in which he had grown up, and perhaps never see the people he loved again. It was a painful decision, but he believed pain was preferable to becoming the monster described by the prophecy. What Oedipus could not understand was that his sacrifice was built upon a hidden mistake. Polybus was not his biological father. Merope was not his biological mother. The two people he was desperately trying to protect had never been the people named by the oracle. And by leaving their kingdom, Oedipus was unknowingly traveling toward the very family from whom he should have remained far away. The road carried him through the rugged landscape of central Greece, where mountains rose around narrow routes traveled by merchants, messengers, pilgrims, soldiers, shepherds, and nobles moving between the scattered cities of the ancient Greek world. There were no signs telling Oedipus that one road led toward safety and another toward disaster. There was only dust beneath his feet, the changing landscape around him, and the terrible words of the oracle repeating somewhere in his thoughts. Perhaps he told himself that distance was enough. Every mile away from Corinth meant another mile, separating Polybus from the son supposedly destined to kill him. Every night spent elsewhere meant Merope remained safe. Oedipus could not control fate, but perhaps he could control where he lived. That small belief gave him a direction. Eventually, he approached a narrow place, where roads met, traditionally associated with the region near Phocis, where the routes toward Delphi, Daulis, and Thebes came together. In later retellings, it would become simply the crossroads, one of the most famous locations in Greek tragedy. At first, there was nothing remarkable about it. Travelers encountered one another on roads constantly. Most passed without incident, but approaching from the opposite direction was an older man traveling with attendants. That man was Laius, king of Thebes. Years had passed since Laius had ordered his infant son taken away to die. As far as he knew, the terrible prophecy concerning that child had been defeated long ago. The baby could not kill his father because the baby had never grown into a man. Perhaps Laius had eventually stopped thinking about it every day. Perhaps the prophecy had faded into one of those memories people deliberately avoid because revisiting it would force them to confront what they had done. But now the child he believed dead was walking toward him. Neither recognized the other. Oedipus did not know the face of the father who had rejected him before memory began. Laius had last seen his son as an infant and could not possibly have recognized the grown traveler approaching along the road. To them, they were simply strangers whose journeys happened to intersect. And this is where the myth becomes especially cruel, because both men had spent years believing they had escaped the same prophecy. Laius believed his son was dead. Oedipus believed his father was safely living in Corinth. Each possessed a false certainty created by incomplete knowledge. Now, those certainties were about to collide in a space barely wide enough for their pride. Ancient sources differ in some details of the confrontation, but the central event remains consistent. A dispute began over passage along the narrow road. Laius was a king, accustomed to others moving aside. Oedipus was a young nobleman who had grown up believing himself the son of a king and was not accustomed to being treated as insignificant. Someone ordered Oedipus out of the way. He refused. The disagreement escalated. What could have been a momentary inconvenience became an exchange of anger, and anger became violence. In Sophocles' account, Oedipus later describes being struck by the driver and then by the older man himself. His response was immediate and devastating. Oedipus fought back. In the struggle that followed, Laius and most of his attendants were killed. One servant escaped. Then the road became quiet again. The encounter may have lasted only minutes. Oedipus stood among men who had been alive shortly before, perhaps still carrying the anger that had driven him into the confrontation. To him, the older stranger was simply an arrogant traveller whose aggression had led to violence. Oedipus had no reason to connect what had happened with Delphi. He had not killed Polybus. Therefore, as far as he understood, he had not killed his father. Somewhere in Corinth, Polybus remained alive. The prophecy still appeared to be something Oedipus was successfully avoiding. But the first half of it had already been fulfilled. The man lying dead beside the crossroads was Laius, king of Thebes, and Oedipus was his son. The tragedy had required no recognition, no deliberate act of patricide, and no conscious decision to challenge destiny. In fact, Oedipus had encountered Laius only because he was trying to avoid killing the man he mistakenly believed was his father. The attempt to escape the prophecy had placed him directly in its path. This idea lies at the heart of the Oedipus myth. Fate does not chase Oedipus like a monster following behind him. Oedipus carries himself toward it through decisions that seem reasonable based upon what he knows. He is not walking toward disaster because he wants disaster. He is walking toward disaster because he wants to prevent it. Had Polybus and Merope told him that he had been adopted, perhaps he would have interpreted the oracle differently. Had Laius not attempted to kill his infant son, perhaps Oedipus would have grown up knowing his biological parents and understood exactly whom the prophecy concerned. Had the servant obeyed Laius completely, Oedipus would have died and the prophecy would never have been fulfilled. Had Laius simply allowed the young stranger to pass peacefully at the crossroads, both might have continued in opposite directions. The tragedy depends upon dozens of human decisions, each one seemingly small enough to change, yet together they create a future that appears inevitable. Oedipus eventually continued along the road. Behind him lay the body of the father he had spent his entire journey trying not to kill. Ahead of him lay Thebes, the city in which his mother still lived. He knew neither fact. Meanwhile, the surviving attendant from Laius's party eventually carried news of the king's death back toward Thebes. The city had lost its ruler, but the circumstances were confused. Later testimony would describe the attack in ways that did not immediately identify a single traveller as the killer, and in a world without photographs, modern records, or rapid communication, the stranger who had disappeared along the road could easily vanish into anonymity. The people of Thebes mourned Laius, but they had another problem demanding their attention, one far more immediate than investigating a death on a distant road. For some time, according to the famous tradition, Thebes had been suffering beneath the terror of a mysterious creature positioned near the approaches to the city. She was the Sphinx, usually imagined in Greek tradition, with the body of a lion, the wings of a great bird, and the head or upper body of a woman. Her presence had turned travel into fear. Anyone attempting to pass was confronted with a riddle. Those unable to answer correctly were killed. The road into Thebes had therefore become a place of dread. The Sphinx did not need an army. She required only a question. Again and again, travelers failed. The city could not easily remove her. Warriors might possess strength, but strength could not solve a riddle. Weapons could confront ordinary enemies, but the Sphinx's challenge demanded something different. Thebes needed a mind capable of understanding what others could not. And unknowingly, the person approaching the city was exactly such a man. Oedipus had no intention of becoming king of Thebes. He did not know that the throne had just become vacant because of his own actions. He did not know that the widowed queen inside the city was the woman who had given birth to him. He was simply a traveller who could not return to Corinth and needed somewhere else to build a life. Yet, as he moved toward Thebes, rumours of the Sphinx and her deadly challenge would have been difficult to avoid. Travellers would have spoken of the creature. People approaching the region might have warned him not to continue. There were roads a sensible person might choose not to travel when everyone returning from them carried stories of death. But Oedipus had already abandoned almost everything familiar. Perhaps danger on another road seemed less frightening than returning toward the prophecy he believed waited in Corinth. And there was another part of his character that now became important. Oedipus trusted his intelligence. The same confidence that had helped turn a dispute at the crossroads into catastrophe could also give him the courage to confront a problem everyone else feared. The Sphinx did not ask challengers to defeat her physically. She asked them to think, Oedipus continued. Eventually he reached the place associated with the creature. Imagine the landscape becoming strangely quiet as he approached. The road that should have carried merchants and travelers was nearly empty. The walls of Thebes stood somewhere beyond, but between Oedipus and the city waited the figure whose riddle had defeated everyone before him. The Sphinx looked upon another traveler. Perhaps, from her perspective, there was nothing remarkable about him. Many confident men had approached before. Some may have arrived carrying weapons. Others may have boasted that the riddle could not possibly be difficult. Confidence had not saved them. The rules were simple. Oedipus would hear the question. If he answered incorrectly, he would share the fate of those who had come before. If he answered correctly, something unprecedented would happen. The famous riddle is usually given in a form resembling this. What creature has 4 feet in the morning, 2 feet at noon, and 3 feet in the evening? It sounds impossible if understood literally. No ordinary animal changes the number of its legs as the sun crosses the sky. But Oedipus recognized that morning, noon, and evening were not really times of day. They represented stages of life. The creature was a human being. In the morning of life, an infant crawls upon hands and knees, moving on 4 limbs. In adulthood, the person walks upright upon 2 legs. And in the evening of life, old age may require a walking stick, creating a 3rd point of support. The answer was man. For perhaps the first time since the Sphinx had taken her position near Thebes, someone had solved the riddle. The creature had been defeated not by a sword, not by an army, and not by a hero possessing supernatural strength, but by a man who understood the meaning hidden inside a question. According to the familiar myth, the Sphinx then destroyed herself, often described as throwing herself from a high place. The road to Thebes was free. News travelled toward the city. The stranger had done what nobody else could do. The people who had lived beneath the Sphinx's terror could travel again. Families who had feared the road could breathe more easily. And Oedipus, who had arrived as a man without a home, suddenly entered Thebes as its savior. The timing seemed almost miraculous. King Laius was dead. The city needed leadership. The Sphinx was gone because of Oedipus. Here was an intelligent, courageous stranger of noble bearing who had delivered Thebes from a threat that had defeated everyone else. The people had no reason to suspect that this stranger was connected to the dead king. Oedipus himself had no reason to suspect it either, and so the city prepared to reward him. The throne of Thebes would become his. But a throne was not the only thing waiting. Laius had left behind a widow, Queen Jocasta. A new king could marry the widowed queen and restore stability to the royal household. To everyone in Thebes, it was a sensible political arrangement. To Oedipus, Jocasta was simply a woman he had never met. To Jocasta, Oedipus was simply the remarkable young stranger who had saved her city. She had once had a son, but that baby had been taken away many years earlier, and as far as she knew, had died on Mount Cithaeron. There was no reason for her to look at the grown man before her and imagine the infant she had lost. The scars upon Oedipus's feet carried the truth, but nobody yet asked the right question about them. And so, the second half of the prophecy approached fulfillment with the same terrible blindness as the first. Oedipus had left Corinth specifically to prevent himself from marrying his mother. He had crossed mountains, abandoned his inheritance, and accepted permanent separation from Merope, because he believed distance could protect her. Now the people of Thebes welcomed him through their gates. They celebrated the man who had solved the Sphinx's riddle. They offered him the throne, once occupied by the stranger he had killed at the crossroads. And beside that throne stood the dead king's widow. Oedipus believed he had finally found a place far enough from Corinth to begin again. He believed the prophecy remained behind him. He believed Polybus was alive, Merope was safe, and the terrible future described at Delphi had been avoided. Then Oedipus became king of Thebes and married Queen Jocasta. The city celebrated. The kingdom had a ruler again. The Sphinx was gone. Order had returned. Years would pass. Oedipus and Jocasta would build a family together and have children of their own. To the people of Thebes, their king appeared blessed by fortune. He had arrived when the city needed him most, solved the impossible riddle, taken the throne, and restored stability after Laius's death. But beneath that peaceful royal household were 2 truths nobody understood. Oedipus had killed the previous king, and the woman sleeping beside him was not simply the previous king's widow, she was his mother. For many years, those truths remained silent. Then, slowly, Thebes began to suffer again. And this time, there would be no Sphinx waiting outside the walls. The enemy would be hidden inside the story of the king himself. For a time, Oedipus must have believed that the darkest part of his life was finally behind him. He had left Corinth carrying the unbearable weight of the oracle's prophecy, crossed unfamiliar lands with no intention of ever seeing the people he loved again, survived the violent encounter at the crossroads, confronted the Sphinx outside Thebes, solved the riddle that had defeated everyone before him, and entered a city that welcomed him not as a wandering stranger, but as a savior. Everything that had seemed uncertain suddenly appeared to have found its proper place. The people of Thebes needed a king, and Oedipus needed a home. Queen Jocasta had lost her husband, and Oedipus had voluntarily separated himself from the family he believed he could never safely approach again. The arrangement that followed seemed not merely reasonable, but fortunate. Oedipus married Jocasta and became king of Thebes, inheriting the throne once occupied by Laius, without knowing that the dead king had been his biological father. Jocasta accepted Oedipus as her new husband without knowing that the young man before her was the infant she had once believed abandoned to death. And so the prophecy that had terrified 2 generations of the same family was fulfilled, while almost everyone involved believed it had been successfully avoided. Oedipus had killed his father. Oedipus had married his mother, yet there was no thunder from the sky, no divine voice announcing what had happened, and no sudden revelation inside the palace. Life simply continued. That quiet continuation is one of the most unsettling parts of the myth. We often imagine terrible truths revealing themselves immediately, as though the universe cannot tolerate them remaining hidden. But the story of Oedipus allows years to pass. The truth sits silently beneath ordinary life. Oedipus wakes each morning believing himself the legitimate ruler of Thebes. Jocasta looks at him and sees her husband. The citizens see the intelligent king who rescued them from the Sphinx. Servants move through the palace. Counselors bring problems before the throne. Farmers work outside the city. Merchants enter through gates that are safe again. Children grow. Seasons change. And nobody understands what has already happened. Oedipus proved himself an effective ruler. Sophocles presents him not as a cruel king whom the audience should eagerly watch fall, but as a man deeply concerned with the suffering of his people. That distinction is essential. The tragedy would be much simpler if Oedipus were obviously evil. Instead, he possesses many qualities expected of a good ruler. He is intelligent. He acts quickly when Thebes is threatened. He wants answers. He refuses to ignore suffering simply because the palace itself remains comfortable. His greatest strengths, however, are closely connected to the qualities that will eventually destroy the life he has built. The intelligence that solved the Sphinx's riddle makes him confident that every mystery can be solved. The determination that saved Thebes makes him unwilling to stop searching once he begins. The pride that helped him confront danger makes it difficult for him to accept warnings from people who know things he does not. Oedipus is a man who believes problems yield when pursued hard enough. Because one of the greatest moments of his life proved exactly that. The Sphinx had presented a mystery. Oedipus found the answer. The city had been trapped. Oedipus freed it. Now, whenever another mystery appeared, why should he behave differently? Years passed within the royal household. Oedipus and Jocasta had children together, traditionally named Eteocles, Polynices, Antigone, and Ismene. To Oedipus, they were simply his sons and daughters. He had no way of understanding the disturbing complexity hidden within their family relationships. Jocasta was both their mother and their grandmother. Oedipus was both their father and their half-brother. Yet none of those biological facts changed what the children themselves experienced. They grew inside a royal family. They knew Oedipus as their father and Jocasta as their mother. They lived beneath the protection of the palace and inherited the status attached to the rulers of Thebes. Once again, innocence existed beside a truth it could not understand. The children had done nothing wrong. Oedipus believed he had done nothing resembling the prophecy. Jocasta believed the infant connected with the old oracle had died long ago. The family could therefore live together without consciously carrying the horror that later generations would associate with their names. Perhaps this period was the happiest Oedipus ever knew. He had sacrificed Corinth to protect Polybus and Merope, but he had found another home. He had lost the future he expected as Prince of Corinth, but gained a kingdom through his own intelligence. He had feared becoming a source of destruction, yet the people of Thebes regarded him as the man who had saved them. If Oedipus ever thought about Delphi during those years, he might have taken comfort in the apparent failure of the prophecy. Polybus was still alive in Corinth. Oedipus had never returned to harm him. Merope remained far away. Oedipus had married Jocasta, a woman he believed completely unrelated to him. Perhaps he began to think the oracle had been misunderstood. Perhaps destiny could indeed be defeated through careful choices. We cannot know exactly what Oedipus imagined during those quiet years, because the tragedy becomes interested in him again when quiet life begins to collapse. It starts not with a messenger arriving to accuse Oedipus of murder, nor with the surviving servant suddenly recognizing him, nor with Jocasta discovering the scars upon his feet. Instead, Thebes begins to die. A plague falls upon the city. The world that Oedipus had once rescued from the Sphinx becomes filled with suffering again. Crops fail, animals suffer, women struggle to bear healthy children, disease moves through households, death becomes familiar. The exact descriptions belong to the poetic and religious world of ancient tragedy, where illness affecting an entire city could be understood not merely as a natural event, but as evidence that something within the community had become polluted in the eyes of the gods. To the citizens, this was not simply another difficult season. Something was deeply wrong with Thebes. And when people suffer, they look toward whoever possesses the power to help. Once again, they turn to Oedipus. At the beginning of Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, citizens gather before the king, seeking relief. They remember what he accomplished before. When the Sphinx tormented Thebes, Oedipus found the answer nobody else could find. Now another invisible enemy was destroying them, and perhaps their king could save them again. There is something tragically beautiful about their faith in him. They do not yet know that the mystery Oedipus must solve is Oedipus himself. The king does not dismiss their suffering. He tells them that he has already been thinking about the crisis and has already acted. He has sent Creon, Jocasta's brother, to the oracle at Delphi to ask Apollo what must be done. Oedipus is therefore behaving exactly as a responsible king should. He does not wait for the people to force him into action. He seeks knowledge. He wants to identify the source of the disaster and remove it. Soon, Creon returns with an answer. The plague will not leave Thebes until an old crime has been addressed. King Laius, the ruler before Oedipus, was murdered, and his killer remains unpunished. The pollution created by that murder still exists within the land. The murderer must be identified and driven out, or punished before Thebes can be cleansed. For Oedipus, the task sounds difficult but straightforward. Somewhere there is a killer. Find him, punish him, save the city. It is another riddle. And Oedipus is the man who solved the Sphinx. He begins asking why Laius's murder had never been properly investigated. The answer is understandable. At the time, Thebes had been consumed by the crisis of the Sphinx. The city had more immediate problems than pursuing a killer along distant roads. According to the information available, Laius had left Thebes and been attacked during his journey. Almost everyone traveling with him had died. One servant survived and returned with an account suggesting that robbers had been responsible. The case had never been resolved. Oedipus now declares that he will investigate it. His determination is not merely political. Laius had been the king of the city, Oedipus now rules. Whoever murdered Laius could potentially threaten the current king as well. Oedipus even reasons that solving Laius's murder protects himself. The irony is almost unbearable. Oedipus promises to pursue the murderer as though Laius had been his own father. Without knowing it, he speaks more truthfully than anyone listening understands. Then he goes further. Oedipus publicly curses the unknown killer. Whoever committed the murder, he declares, must be excluded. No citizen should shelter him. No one should speak with him or include him in religious life. The murderer must become an outcast until justice is done. Oedipus places the full authority of the throne behind the investigation. He does not create an exception for someone important. He does not say the murderer should be forgiven if enough time has passed. He wants truth and punishment, and in doing so, Oedipus unknowingly pronounces judgment upon himself. The audience of the ancient tragedy already knew the myth. They knew who killed Laius. They knew who Oedipus had married. So every confident declaration from the king carried a second meaning. Oedipus believed he was tightening a net around an unknown criminal. The audience understood that he was tightening it around himself. But Oedipus still lacked the information necessary to see the pattern. The murder happened years earlier. The violent encounter at the crossroads had been only one event during his journey away from Corinth. He had no reason to believe the older stranger had been a king, and importantly, the surviving account spoke of multiple robbers rather than one attacker. That detail offered enough difference for the truth to remain hidden. Oedipus needed someone capable of seeing what ordinary witnesses could not. The people of Thebes knew of such a person, Tiresias, the famous blind prophet. Tiresias occupies a strange position in Greek mythology. He lacks physical sight, yet possesses knowledge hidden from those who can see. Oedipus possesses healthy eyes and extraordinary intelligence, yet remains blind to the truth of his own identity. The contrast is deliberate. The man who cannot see knows, the man who can see does not. Oedipus orders Tiresias brought before him. Perhaps he expects cooperation. A prophet with divine insight should be the perfect person to identify Laius's murderer. If Tiresias knows the answer, Oedipus can act immediately and save Thebes. But when the prophet arrives, something unexpected happens. Tiresias does not want to speak. He knows what Oedipus is asking. More importantly, he understands what the answer will do. Truth is usually presented as something valuable, something that frees people from ignorance. The story of Oedipus asks a more uncomfortable question. What happens when truth cannot repair anything, when knowing only destroys the life built upon not knowing? Tiresias understands that some knowledge arrives like a wound. He tells Oedipus, in effect, that it would be better for both of them if he returned home without answering. Oedipus cannot accept this. The city is dying. People are suffering. The prophet appears to possess information that could help, yet refuses to provide it. From Oedipus's perspective, silence begins to resemble betrayal. He pressures Tiresias. The prophet resists. Oedipus becomes angry. He accuses Tiresias of withholding information from the king, and even begins to suspect that the prophet may somehow have been involved in Laius's murder. This escalation reveals one of Oedipus's deepest weaknesses. When confronted with resistance, he becomes increasingly certain that resistance must hide guilt or conspiracy. The possibility that Tiresias is silent to protect him does not occur to him. Eventually, the prophet can tolerate no more. Tiresias speaks. The murderer Oedipus seeks is not hidden somewhere beyond the walls of Thebes. He is standing before Tiresias. Oedipus himself is the pollution within the city. The accusation is so impossible that Oedipus does not experience it as revelation. He experiences it as insult. He knows who he is. He is Oedipus, son of Polybus and Merope, raised in Corinth. He arrived in Thebes only after Laius had supposedly been murdered. He saved the city. He married its widowed queen. Why would Tiresias accuse him? Oedipus searches for an explanation that fits the world as he understands it, and conspiracy becomes easier to believe than truth. Perhaps Creon wants the throne. Perhaps Tiresias is working with him. Perhaps the entire accusation has been constructed to remove Oedipus from power. Tiresias, however, continues. His words become darker. Oedipus does not know who his true parents are. The man he seeks is both father and brother to his own children, both son and husband to the woman with whom he lives, and both murderer and successor to the man who fathered him. The language sounds almost like another riddle. Years earlier, the Sphinx had asked Oedipus to identify a creature whose identity changed through the stages of life. Now, Tiresias describes a man whose family relationships contain impossible overlaps. Once again, the answer is Oedipus. But this time, Oedipus cannot solve the riddle, because solving it requires destroying his understanding of himself. He orders Tiresias away. The prophet leaves, but the words remain. Oedipus can dismiss a man from the palace. He cannot dismiss an accusation from his own mind quite so easily. Creon soon becomes the target of his anger. Oedipus confronts him, convinced that Jocasta's brother has organized the prophecy as part of an attempt to seize power. Creon responds logically. Why would he want the burdens of kingship when he already enjoys influence and privilege without carrying the king's responsibilities? He has little reason to replace Oedipus. Their argument grows intense enough that Jocasta intervenes. She wants to understand what has caused the conflict. Oedipus explains that Tiresias has accused him of murdering Laius, and that he suspects Creon of arranging the accusation. Jocasta tries to calm him, and in doing so, she says something intended to prove that prophecies cannot be trusted. Years earlier, she explains, Laius received an oracle saying he would die at the hands of his own son. But that never happened. Their infant son had been taken away and abandoned, his ankles pierced or bound, and Laius was later killed by strangers or robbers at a place where three roads met. Jocasta offers the story as reassurance. The prophecy failed, therefore Oedipus should not fear Tiresias. But Oedipus stops listening to the reassurance. One detail has caught him: three roads. He asks Jocasta exactly where Laius died. She describes the place. Oedipus asks what Laius looked like. Jocasta tells him. He asks how many people travelled with the king. She answers. With every response, the memory of an old road becomes clearer. Oedipus remembers the older man. He remembers the attendants. He remembers the argument. He remembers the violence. For the first time, the stranger he killed begins to acquire another identity. Oedipus asks when the murder occurred. Jocasta explains that news of Laius's death reached Thebes shortly before Oedipus himself became king. The timeline fits, the location fits, the description fits. Something inside Oedipus begins to change. Minutes earlier, he had confidently accused Tiresias and Creon of conspiracy. Now he is asking questions more quietly, because the answers are no longer pointing outward. They are pointing backward. He tells Jocasta about the encounter at the crossroads. He does not yet know that Laius was his father. That possibility remains hidden behind the belief that Polybus is his father. But another terrible possibility has opened. Perhaps Oedipus really did kill the previous king of Thebes. If so, the curse he pronounced upon Laius's murderer applies to himself. And if the oracle says the murderer must be expelled before the plague will end, then Oedipus may be the very person destroying the city he once saved. Still, one detail offers hope. The surviving servant reportedly said Laius had been attacked by a group of robbers. Oedipus had been alone. If the servant confirms that several men attacked the king, then Oedipus cannot be the murderer. The entire nightmare may collapse. Oedipus asks where that servant is now. Jocasta explains that after Oedipus became king, the man requested permission to leave the city and work in the countryside. He had seen Oedipus take Laius's throne and apparently wanted to live far away from the palace. Jocasta had allowed it. Oedipus orders the servant brought back. Everything now depends upon one old man's memory. If he says many robbers killed Laius, Oedipus may still be innocent. If he says one traveller did it, then the king's investigation will have found its murderer. But even that would not reveal the deepest truth. Oedipus still believes Polybus and Merope are his parents. He still believes he escaped the prophecy by leaving Corinth. He is frightened that he may have killed Laius. But he cannot yet imagine why fate would have brought him to that particular crossroads. Then, before the old servant can arrive, another visitor comes to the palace. A messenger has travelled from Corinth. At first, the news he carries appears completely unrelated to the mystery-consuming Thebes. In fact, it seems like the first good news Oedipus has received since the plague began. King Polybus of Corinth is dead. The people of Corinth now want Oedipus to return and take his father's throne. Oedipus hears the words and experiences immediate relief. Polybus is dead, but Oedipus did not kill him. The oracle had said Oedipus would kill his father, yet Polybus died while Oedipus was far away in Thebes. Perhaps the prophecy really was false. Perhaps Jocasta was right to distrust oracles. Perhaps Tiresias was wrong. Perhaps Oedipus can finally stop running from the future. For a brief moment, the entire terrible structure seems ready to collapse harmlessly. Oedipus has not killed his father, but one fear remains. Merope is still alive. The second part of the prophecy said he would marry his mother. Oedipus, therefore, refuses to return to Corinth while she lives. The messenger hears this explanation and responds with information he believes will comfort the king. Oedipus does not need to fear Merope, he says, because Polybus and Merope were not his biological parents. Oedipus stares at him. The messenger continues. Many years ago, when Oedipus was only an infant, the messenger himself had received the baby from another shepherd. The child's ankles had been injured or bound. He had taken the infant to Polybus and Merope, who raised him as their own son. The room that had seemed moments earlier to contain good news becomes suddenly quiet. Oedipus had spent his entire adult life running from Corinth because he believed Polybus and Merope were the parents named by the oracle. Now, with a few ordinary sentences from an old messenger, the foundation of that belief disappears. Polybus was never his father. Merope was never his biological mother. The prophecy has not failed at all. Oedipus asks the question that must now be asked. Who gave the baby to the Corinthian messenger? The answer brings the story back toward Thebes. It was another shepherd, a servant belonging to the household of Laius. Jocasta understands before Oedipus does. Suddenly, the old prophecy, the abandoned infant, the wounded feet, the death at the crossroads, the stranger who arrived in Thebes, and the husband standing before her no longer exist as separate stories. They become one story, her story, his story, their son's story. Jocasta begs Oedipus to stop asking questions. Only a short time earlier, she had tried to reassure him that prophecies meant nothing. Now she desperately wants the investigation to end before another word is spoken, but Oedipus misunderstands her fear. Perhaps, he thinks, Jocasta is ashamed that he may have been born to a poor family. Perhaps she fears discovering that her royal husband came from humble origins. Oedipus tells her that he must know the truth, regardless of what it reveals about his birth. Jocasta pleads again, do not continue, do not ask, let the past remain where it is. But Oedipus cannot. The same determination that once saved Thebes now drives him forward. He solved the Sphinx because he refused to be defeated by a question. He pursued Laius's murderer because he refused to allow a mystery to remain unresolved. Now, the mystery is his own identity. And although everyone around him begins to understand that the answer will destroy him, Oedipus insists upon hearing it. Jocasta leaves, Oedipus remains, and waits for the old shepherd to be brought before him. Somewhere beyond the palace, the man is approaching. He is no ordinary witness. Decades earlier, Laius and Jocasta placed a newborn child into his hands and ordered him to abandon that child on Mount Cithaeron. Instead, he gave the baby to another shepherd. He had carried the secret through all the years that followed. Then one day, he saw a new king sitting upon Laius's throne, and perhaps he recognized something that made him request permission to disappear into the countryside. Now Oedipus has ordered him back. The Corinthian messenger is already waiting. The two old men are about to stand together before the king. One received the infant, the other gave him away, and Oedipus, who has spent his entire life running from a prophecy, is finally only a few questions away from discovering that he has already fulfilled every word of it. The old shepherd was brought before Oedipus, carrying a secret he had kept for many years, and although the king standing before him had spent his entire life without knowing this man, the shepherd knew exactly where their stories had first crossed. Long ago, when Oedipus had been an infant unable to speak, unable to walk, and unable even to understand the danger surrounding him, this same servant had received an order from the royal household of Thebes. King Laius and Queen Jocasta had been terrified by the prophecy that their son would one day kill his father, and the baby had been given to the shepherd to be abandoned on Mount Cithaeron. The child's feet had been injured and bound, and the intention had been clear. He was not supposed to return, yet the shepherd had looked at the infant and failed to carry the order through to its final conclusion. Whether from pity, hesitation, or simple unwillingness to leave a helpless child to die, he had handed the baby to another man, a shepherd from Corinth. That small act of mercy had saved Oedipus's life. It had also preserved the possibility that the prophecy might one day be fulfilled. Now, decades later, the two men connected by that forgotten exchange stood in the same place again. The Corinthian messenger who had received the baby was present. The Theban shepherd who had given him away had arrived. And between them stood Oedipus, no longer an abandoned infant, but the king of Thebes, demanding to know exactly where he had come from. At first, the old shepherd did not want to answer. Perhaps the moment he saw the Corinthian messenger, he understood why he had been summoned. Perhaps he had spent years hoping this conversation would never occur. He had survived Laius, survived the Sphinx, survived the change of kings, and escaped quietly into the countryside after Oedipus took the throne. Silence had protected him for a long time, but now the past had entered the palace and called him by name. Oedipus began with questions about Laius. Had the shepherd once served the former king? Yes. Had he been part of Laius's household? Yes. The answers came reluctantly. Then the Corinthian messenger recognized him. This was the man, he explained, who had given him the infant many years earlier. The shepherd tried to stop him. He dismissed the conversation as old and irrelevant, but Oedipus had already learned too much to accept silence. Every answer gathered during the investigation had moved closer to one central question. Who were his real parents? Polybus and Merope were no longer possible. The messenger had confirmed that. The child had come from Thebes. The wounds upon his feet matched the story. Jocasta's strange terror had become impossible to ignore. And now, the one person capable of connecting every remaining piece was trying desperately not to speak. Oedipus pressed him harder. Where had the baby come from? The shepherd hesitated. Oedipus demanded an answer. The old man begged him not to continue. There is a terrible symmetry here with Tiresias. Earlier, the blind prophet had known the truth and refused to reveal it because he understood what knowledge would do to Oedipus. The king had interpreted that silence as resistance and forced him to speak. Now another man stood before Oedipus, doing almost exactly the same thing. Once again, someone who knew the truth was begging the king to remain ignorant. Once again, Oedipus could not accept it. His entire identity depended upon the answer. He threatened the shepherd with punishment if he refused to speak. Finally, trapped between the king's demand and the secret he had protected for decades, the old man began to surrender the truth. The baby had not been his own. It had come from the household of Laius. Oedipus asked whether the child had been born to one of the servants. The shepherd resisted again. The king demanded more. And then the final answer came. The child had been said to be Laius's son. Jocasta herself had given the baby to the shepherd because of the prophecy surrounding his birth. She had ordered the child destroyed because it had been foretold that he would kill his father. But the shepherd had pitied him. Instead of leaving him to die, he gave him to the Corinthian man, hoping perhaps that the child would be carried far away and raised where the prophecy could never touch Thebes. That was all Oedipus needed. The mystery that had begun with a drunken insult in Corinth was over. He finally knew who he was. And at exactly the same moment, he understood what he had done. Laius had been his father. The older stranger at the crossroads had been Laius. Oedipus had killed him. Jocasta had been his mother. The widowed queen he married after defeating the Sphinx had been Jocasta. The children they had raised together were therefore born from the union the oracle had foretold. Every terrible statement Oedipus had spent his life trying to prevent had already happened. There was nowhere left to run, because the prophecy was no longer waiting in the future. It had become the past. Imagine the collapse of everything Oedipus believed about himself. Only days earlier, he had been the respected king of Thebes, husband of Jocasta, father of 4 children, celebrated solver of the Sphinx's riddle and protector of the city. He knew his history. He believed he had been born in Corinth, raised by Polybus and Merope, and forced into voluntary exile by a prophecy he had successfully resisted. Now almost every part of that identity had changed, without anything in the physical world changing at all. The palace was still the same palace. The throne was still beneath him. The people outside still called him king. His children were still his children, but the meaning of every relationship had transformed. Polybus was his adoptive father. Merope was his adoptive mother. Laius was his biological father, and also the man he had killed. Jocasta was his wife, and also the woman who had given birth to him. The children who called him father were also his half-siblings through their mother. The throne he believed he had received as a reward for saving Thebes was, by blood, a throne connected to his own family before he ever arrived. Even the scars on his feet, marks he had carried throughout his life without understanding them, became evidence of the attempt made to kill him before memory began. Oedipus had solved the greatest riddle of his life, and the answer was himself. The Sphinx's riddle suddenly seems almost gentle by comparison. That creature had asked what walked on 4 legs, then 2, then 3. Oedipus recognized the answer as a human being moving through infancy, adulthood, and old age. Now, his own investigation had presented another puzzle about a human life. Who was the abandoned infant? The prince of Corinth, the stranger at the crossroads, the savior of Thebes, the husband of Jocasta, and the murderer of Laius. They were not separate people. They were all Oedipus. His intelligence had once elevated him to the throne. Now that same relentless intelligence had stripped away every comforting illusion around it. Oedipus could have stopped many times. Tiresias told him to stop. Jocasta begged him to stop. The shepherd tried not to answer. Each person understood before Oedipus that ignorance might be easier to survive than truth, but Oedipus was incapable of accepting a mystery once he believed an answer existed. This is one reason his tragedy has remained so powerful for thousands of years. His destruction does not come because he is stupid. It comes partly because he insists upon knowing. He possesses the very quality we often admire, the refusal to accept comfortable lies. Yet truth does not reward him. Truth simply reveals what was already there. Oedipus cried out, as the meaning became unavoidable. In Sophocles' tragedy, his language at the moment of recognition is filled with horror at his birth, his marriage, and the blood he has spilled. The king who had once commanded everyone else to identify Laius's murderer now knew the answer. He had publicly cursed that murderer. He had declared that nobody should shelter him. He had promised to remove the pollution from Thebes. Justice, if he truly intended to follow his own decree, could no longer be directed at some unknown criminal. It had to fall upon the king himself. But Oedipus was not the only person whose world had collapsed. Jocasta had understood the truth moments earlier. Her desperate attempt to stop the questioning had failed. She had left the room, while Oedipus continued interrogating the shepherd. We should remember what the revelation meant for her as well. Years before, she had been told that her newborn son would kill his father and marry his mother. Terrified, she and Laius had tried to destroy the child. She had spent years believing the baby died on Mount Cithaeron. Later, Laius was killed while traveling, apparently by strangers, and Jocasta could reassure herself that the prophecy had failed. Her son had died before he could kill his father. Then Oedipus arrived. He was younger than Laius, intelligent, courageous, apparently unrelated to the royal family, and responsible for freeing Thebes from the Sphinx. Jocasta married him. They had children. Life continued. Perhaps the old prophecy became evidence in her mind that oracles could be wrong. She says something close to this when trying to comfort Oedipus earlier in the play. Human beings should not live in fear of prophecies because the prediction concerning Laius had apparently failed. Then Oedipus began asking about the crossroads. He described killing an older man. A messenger arrived from Corinth and explained that Polybus was not Oedipus's biological father. The messenger mentioned the injured feet. He remembered receiving the infant from a Theban shepherd. Jocasta did not need the final interrogation. She knew. The husband with whom she had shared her life was the baby she had once sent away. The man who killed Laius was their son. The children inside the palace were also her grandchildren. And perhaps worst of all, every action taken to prevent the prophecy appeared to have helped create the conditions through which it came true. Had Laius and Jocasta raised their son openly, Oedipus would have known exactly who his parents were. He could have recognized Laius at the crossroads. He could never unknowingly have married Jocasta. But, because they attempted to erase him, he grew up elsewhere without knowledge of his identity. Because Polybus and Merope concealed his adoption, Oedipus misinterpreted the Delphic prophecy. Because he believed they were his biological parents, he left Corinth to protect them. Because he left Corinth, he encountered Laius. Because Laius and Oedipus did not recognize one another, their argument became fatal without either understanding the relationship between them. Because Oedipus then reached Thebes as a stranger, he could marry Jocasta without recognizing her. The attempt to prevent fate had constructed the path toward fate piece by piece. Jocasta returned deeper into the palace alone. Oedipus, after hearing the shepherd's confession, rushed after her. But before he reached her, another tragedy unfolded away from the public investigation. Sophocles does not place Jocasta's death directly before the audience. Ancient Greek tragedy often allowed its most violent events to occur away from the stage and then be described by messengers. Jocasta entered her chamber in despair, mourning Laius, mourning the son she had once tried to lose, and confronting the unbearable reality that husband and son had become the same person. She took her own life. When Oedipus eventually entered the chamber and found her, the search for truth that had begun as an attempt to save Thebes reached its most devastating personal consequence. The woman he loved as his wife was dead. The woman who was his mother was the same woman. Oedipus could no longer separate the roles because the truth had fused them permanently. What followed became one of the most famous images in all of Greek tragedy. Oedipus took the pins or brooches from Jocasta's clothing and used them to blind himself. The act was violent, but its symbolic meaning has echoed through interpretations of the story for centuries. Oedipus had possessed sight while remaining blind to the truth. Tiresias possessed no physical sight, yet saw everything clearly. Now that Oedipus finally understood, he could no longer bear to look upon the world. He had seen his children without knowing what they were to him. He had looked upon Jocasta without recognizing his mother. He had looked upon Laius without recognizing his father. He had looked at himself every day without knowing who he was. Only after seeing the truth did he destroy his ability to see anything else. When Oedipus emerged again, the confident king who opened the investigation had disappeared. He was wounded, grieving, and asking for the punishment he himself had declared. The citizens who once approached him as their savior now faced the horrifying answer to the plague consuming their city. The pollution was not an invading army or supernatural creature outside the walls. It was tied to the unresolved murder of Laius, and Laius's murderer had ruled them from the throne. Yet even now, the story refuses to make Oedipus simple. He did kill Laius, but he did not know Laius was his father. He did marry Jocasta, but he did not know Jocasta was his mother. He had spent years actively trying to prevent both acts. Does ignorance remove guilt? Does fate remove responsibility? If an oracle foretells an action and every attempt to avoid it helps produce it, where does human choice end and destiny begin? Greek tragedy does not provide comfortable answers. Oedipus is responsible for his temper at the crossroads. Nothing required him to allow an argument over passage to become deadly. His pride and anger belonged to him. Yet he did not create the circumstances of his birth. He did not choose to be abandoned. He did not choose to be raised without knowledge of his biological parents. He did not choose the prophecy. His life exists somewhere between choice and fate, which is exactly why audiences have continued arguing about it for centuries. Oedipus now wanted exile. Earlier, he had cursed Laius's murderer and declared that such a person should be driven from Thebes. He could not simply excuse himself because the murderer turned out to be the king. He asked Creon, the man he had recently accused of conspiracy, to take responsibility for the city. The reversal is profound. Oedipus had suspected Creon wanted his throne. Now, Oedipus willingly surrendered power because he no longer believed himself fit to remain. His thoughts also turned toward his children, especially his daughters Antigone and Ismene. They had committed no crime, yet they would inherit the consequences of a truth they had never chosen. Their father was their brother, their mother was their grandmother. The royal household that should have protected them had become the source of a story people would repeat with horror. Oedipus feared what kind of future awaited them in a society where family lineage carried enormous importance. This concern reveals that even at the lowest point of his life, Oedipus remains a father. The relationships may have become biologically tangled, but his love for the children is not suddenly unreal. They are innocent. Just as Oedipus himself had once been innocent when adults pierced his feet and sent him toward Mount Cithaeron. Another generation is now forced to live, with consequences created before it understood anything. The cycle has moved forward. Eventually, Oedipus would leave the palace that had once welcomed him as a hero. The man who entered Thebes after solving the Sphinx's riddle had possessed everything: intelligence, reputation, kingship, marriage, children, and the gratitude of an entire city. The man preparing to leave had lost his wife and mother, discovered that he had killed his father, surrendered his throne, blinded himself, and learned that the identity he carried for most of his life had been built upon a secret. Yet there was one thing Oedipus possessed now that he had never possessed during his years of apparent happiness. He knew the truth. It had cost almost everything, but there were no more hidden parents, no more mysterious scars, no more unanswered questions about the crossroads, and no more prophecy waiting somewhere ahead. For the first time in his life, Oedipus knew exactly who he was. The knowledge brought no comfort. But the running was over. He had spent his youth fleeing Corinth because he feared the future. Now there was nowhere left to flee from fate, because fate had already happened. What remained was something quieter, and perhaps even more difficult. Oedipus would have to continue living after learning the truth, and his story would not end inside the palace of Thebes. The blind former king would eventually walk away from the city he had once saved, dependent upon others to guide his steps, carrying neither crown nor certainty about where the road would end. Years earlier, he had approached a crossroads as a proud young traveller and destroyed a stranger who refused to move aside. Now Oedipus himself would become a wandering stranger, moving slowly along unfamiliar roads, no longer able to see what waited ahead, accompanied eventually by the daughter whose devotion would become one of the final gentle lights in his tragic life. When Oedipus finally left the world in which he had once been king, he did so without the confidence, certainty, or physical independence that had defined the younger man who first arrived at Thebes. The traveller who had once walked alone across Greece because he believed he could outrun a prophecy, now needed another person beside him simply to know where the road continued. The man who had solved the riddle of the Sphinx could no longer see the ground beneath his own feet. The ruler, who had once spoken from the highest place in the city, had become an exile, stripped of the throne that had seemed to prove his success, and carrying instead the knowledge that almost everything he had spent his life trying to prevent had already happened. Yet Oedipus was still alive, and this is where his story becomes quieter. The dramatic revelations were behind him. Laius was dead, Jocasta was dead, the prophecy had been fulfilled. There was no final monster for Oedipus to defeat, and no second riddle whose solution could somehow restore the life he had lost. What remained was the long and difficult experience of living after catastrophe. Greek tradition does not preserve every part of Oedipus's later life in exactly the same way, and different works treat the circumstances of his exile differently, but Sophocles would eventually return to the aged Oedipus in Oedipus at Colonus, presenting a man who had wandered for years after the fall of his household. By then, the former king was no longer the furious young traveller of the crossroads, or the confident ruler interrogating Tiresias. Time had changed him. Suffering had changed him. Blindness had forced him to depend upon others. And beside him, through much of the later tradition, walked his daughter, Antigone. There is something deeply important about Antigone remaining with him. Oedipus's discovery had shattered the language of his family. Antigone was his daughter, but because Jocasta was also Oedipus's mother, Antigone was simultaneously connected to him in another generation. Those biological complications would horrify outsiders and become part of the shame surrounding the royal house, but to Antigone, the blind man beside her remained her father. She had not chosen the circumstances of her birth. Oedipus had not knowingly created them. Whatever names society attached to their family, affection did not suddenly disappear because the truth became complicated. Oedipus had lost Jocasta, lost his throne, lost his sight, and lost the identity he had believed throughout most of his life. Antigone gave him something that survived all those losses, someone who still chose to stay. Imagine the difference between this journey and Oedipus's earlier departure from Corinth. The first time he became a wanderer, he was young, strong, sighted, and convinced that his own decision could protect the people he loved. He could choose a road, walk as far as necessary, defend himself, and imagine countless possible futures. He was leaving a home voluntarily because he believed exile would defeat destiny. Now he walked as an older man who understood that destiny had not been defeated at all. He could not see which direction the road turned. He could not easily travel without assistance. Instead of escaping an unknown future, he was carrying a known past. Every step away from Thebes took him farther from the palace, where the truth had destroyed his life. But no distance could separate him from what he knew. That is perhaps the cruelest difference between physical exile and memory. You can leave a city, you can cross mountains, you can sleep beneath another sky, but you cannot walk far enough to leave your own history behind. Oedipus had once believed distance could protect him from prophecy. Now he knew that distance could not even protect him from remembrance. Yet his wandering years were not simply an extended punishment. Slowly, the meaning of Oedipus's suffering began to change. When he first blinded himself, he was overwhelmed by horror and shame. He wanted to disappear from the people whose king he had been. But an older Oedipus could look backward upon the same events differently. He had certainly killed Laius, and his violent temper at the crossroads remained part of his responsibility. But had he knowingly killed his father? No. Had he knowingly married his mother? No. Had he deliberately pursued the prophecy? Quite the opposite. From the moment he heard it, Oedipus had sacrificed the life he loved in an attempt to prevent it. He left Polybus and Merope because he believed doing so would keep them safe. He entered Thebes without knowing his biological connection to its royal family. He married Jocasta without recognizing her. The most horrifying parts of his story occurred not because Oedipus desired them, but because crucial truths had been hidden from him. This does not make every action innocent, but it complicates the simple idea that Oedipus deserved everything that happened. The older man in Oedipus, at Colonus, is capable of defending himself. He no longer accepts every part of the shame that once crushed him. There is dignity in that change. Oedipus cannot undo his past, but he can begin distinguishing between what he intended and what fate placed before him. Perhaps this is one of the quietest lessons in the later myth. Accepting responsibility does not require claiming responsibility for things you could not possibly have known. For years, Oedipus had defined himself through guilt. Time allows him to see another possibility. He was also a man used by circumstances older than his own memory. His story began with a prophecy delivered to his father. His feet were wounded before he could understand pain. He was sent away before he could speak. Adults concealed his origins. By the time Oedipus became capable of making choices for himself, he was already living inside consequences created by other people. He still made mistakes. His anger mattered. His pride mattered. His decisions mattered, but they were not the entire story. As Oedipus and Antigone travelled, the landscape around them would have been very different from the palace of Thebes. The ancient Greek world was connected by roads and paths, passing through cultivated land. Rocky hills, wooded areas, shrines, villages, and territories belonging to different cities. A blind traveller could not simply move through these places without assistance. Antigone became his eyes. She could warn him about uneven ground. She could describe what stood ahead. She could guide him toward shelter or water. The father who once protected his children from the security of a royal palace now depended upon his daughter for the simplest movements. Yet dependence does not necessarily diminish a person. Oedipus had spent much of his younger life believing strength meant solving problems himself. He solved the Sphinx alone. He confronted travelers alone. He interrogated witnesses because he believed his own determination would reach the truth. Blindness forced another lesson upon him. Human beings sometimes survive by allowing someone else to guide them. The relationship between Oedipus and Antigone therefore offers a gentle contrast to the violence surrounding the earlier generations of their family. Laius had responded to fear of his son by trying to destroy him. Oedipus's children, despite everything associated with their father, could respond to his suffering with care. One generation tried to escape fate by breaking a family apart. Another attempted to endure fate by refusing to abandon one another. Oedipus eventually approached the region of Attica, near Athens, and arrived at Colonus, a place sacred to the Eumenides, mysterious goddesses associated with vengeance, justice, and the transformation of older, destructive powers into protectors. To Oedipus, exhausted from years of wandering, the place would become the final destination of his journey. Yet even here, peace did not arrive immediately. Local people were alarmed when they discovered a stranger occupying sacred ground. Oedipus learned where he had arrived and began to understand that this might be the location foretold for the end of his life. In Oedipus, at Colonus, he believes that the gods have finally brought him to the place where his wandering should stop. After spending so much of his life fearing prophecies, Oedipus now responds differently to divine prediction. As a young man, prophecy made him run. As an old man, prophecy gives him permission to remain. That reversal captures how deeply he has changed. The younger Oedipus heard that terrible things would happen and immediately tried to control geography, relationships, and future events. The older Oedipus understands that some things cannot be controlled. He asks instead for a place where he may finally rest. But Oedipus cannot simply settle in another city's sacred land without attracting attention. News of his presence reaches Theseus, king of Athens. This is the same Theseus known elsewhere in Greek mythology for the Minotaur and the Labyrinth, though here he appears not as a young monster-slaying hero, but as a ruler. The meeting between Theseus and Oedipus creates a striking contrast. One man possesses a kingdom, the other once possessed one. Theseus can see, Oedipus cannot. Theseus stands securely within his own territory. Oedipus has wandered without a home. Yet, Theseus does not treat the former king simply as a polluted criminal. He listens, he offers protection, he recognizes something important in Oedipus's condition because Theseus himself knows what it means to experience exile and uncertainty in mythic tradition. Hospitality, one of the most important moral expectations in the ancient Greek imagination, becomes part of Oedipus's final chapter. The man who had been expelled from one city is accepted by another. Oedipus asks Theseus for sanctuary. In return, he offers something strange. The place where Oedipus eventually dies, he says, will bring protection or blessing to Athens. The body of the man, once treated as pollution in Thebes, will become valuable sacred protection elsewhere. Again, the meaning of Oedipus's identity reverses. Thebes needed him removed because his unresolved actions polluted the city. Athens may benefit from receiving him at the end of his life. The outcast becomes a source of blessing. The cursed man becomes someone whose final resting place kings desire. Greek tragedy rarely leaves identities fixed. King becomes exile, sight becomes blindness, ignorance becomes knowledge, pollution becomes sacred power, and the man who once believed he could determine his own path eventually becomes valuable precisely because he has reached the end of it. Meanwhile, Oedipus's family in Thebes has not found peace. His sons, Eteocles and Polynices, become involved in a struggle over political power. Depending on the tradition, their conflict develops around control of Thebes, eventually leading toward the disastrous war remembered in the story of the Seven against Thebes. Oedipus learns that his sons, instead of caring for him as Antigone has, are concerned with the throne he left behind. The throne that once appeared to Oedipus as the reward for defeating the Sphinx has become another source of division within his family. Power passes from one generation to another, but the suffering attached to it continues. Creon also becomes involved, traveling to Colonus and attempting to persuade or force Oedipus back toward Theban control, because an oracle has apparently revealed that Oedipus's burial place will possess protective significance. There is a painful irony in this sudden interest. The blind exile, who once had to beg for somewhere to live, is now wanted, because people believe possessing his remains will benefit their city. Oedipus recognizes the selfishness. They did not offer him the dignity he needed while he wandered. Yet now that prophecy makes him valuable, they want him near Thebes again. He refuses. Creon attempts to use Oedipus's daughters as leverage, but Theseus and the Athenians intervene and protect them. Once again, Oedipus survives, not because he can physically overpower anyone, but because someone else chooses to stand beside him. The lesson forced upon him by blindness repeats itself. Strength can mean accepting protection. Then Polynices comes to see his father. The meeting is painful. Polynices wants Oedipus's support in his struggle against his brother, Eteocles. He explains his situation and asks for his father's blessing. But Oedipus is bitter toward his sons. In his view, they allowed him to become an exile while pursuing power for themselves. Antigone, a daughter with far less political authority, stayed beside him. His sons did not. Oedipus refuses to support Polynices and pronounces a terrible prediction. The brothers will destroy one another. Antigone begs Polynices to abandon the coming attack upon Thebes, but he feels bound by honor, allies, and the course already chosen. He leaves knowing what his father has foretold. The cycle of prophecy continues into another generation. Once again, someone hears a terrible future. Once again, human pride and existing commitments make changing direction almost impossible. Yet Oedipus himself is approaching a different kind of ending. The sky changes. Thunder is heard, interpreted as a divine sign that his time has arrived. The old man, who once reacted to divine prophecy with terror, now responds with calm recognition. He asks for Theseus. He prepares to go toward the place where he will die. Antigone and Ismene remain near him, but the final mystery of Oedipus's death is treated as something sacred and unusual. According to Sophocles, Oedipus does not simply collapse before everyone. He is led away with Theseus, and the exact location of his final resting place is kept secret, known in a special way to the Athenian king, and eventually passed through the rulers who follow him. The man whose entire tragedy resulted from secrets now becomes a secret himself. But this final secret is different from the one surrounding his birth. The first secret was imposed upon Oedipus and destroyed him because he did not know it. The last belongs partly to Oedipus himself and protects the people who offered him refuge. His story has moved from destructive concealment towards sacred mystery. Before leaving, Oedipus no longer requires Antigone to guide every step. In the strange sacred atmosphere of the final scene, he moves toward his end with an independence that surprises those around him. The blind man who had needed another person's hand along the road now seems to know where he must go. There is no desperate attempt to escape, no road chosen in panic, no argument at a crossroads, no interrogation, no demand that another prophet explain what will happen. Oedipus simply goes. After decades spent running from fate and then living beneath the consequences of fulfilling it, he finally stops resisting the fact that every human journey has an end. And this time, fate does not appear only as punishment. It offers rest. Antigone and Ismene are devastated by the loss of their father. For years they had organized their lives around caring for him, and now the person they guided is gone. They want to know where he rests, but the sacred conditions surrounding his death prevent them from simply visiting a grave as ordinary mourners might. Theseus comforts them and honors the promise made to Oedipus. The former king of Thebes has finally found a home that cannot expel him. He had been born in Thebes but sent away, raised in Corinth but left voluntarily, returned unknowingly to Thebes and was eventually driven from it, wandered across Greece without belonging fully anywhere. Then, at Colonus, near the end of his life, he was accepted not because he solved a riddle, not because he inherited a throne, and not because people misunderstood who he was. Theseus accepted him knowing exactly who Oedipus was and what had happened. That may be one of the most peaceful details in the entire myth. Oedipus spent his happiest years surrounded by people who loved a version of him built upon ignorance. Polybus and Merope loved him while hiding his origins. The people of Thebes celebrated him without knowing he had killed Laius. Jocasta loved him without knowing he was her son. But at Colonus, there is no hidden revelation waiting. Theseus knows the story, Antigone knows the story, Oedipus knows the story, and still he is given somewhere to remain. He does not need another identity. He does not need to pretend the past never happened. He is no longer trying to prove himself innocent of every mistake or powerful enough to defeat every prophecy. He arrives as Oedipus, carrying everything that name now means, and someone says that he may stay. Perhaps this is why the ending of Oedipus's life feels so different from the ending of his kingship. The palace ended in revelation, death, blindness, and horror. Colonus ends in acceptance, not happiness exactly. Too much has happened for the story to become conventionally happy. Jocasta does not return. Laius cannot be restored. Oedipus cannot regain the years lost to ignorance. His children will still face their own tragedies, but Oedipus himself finally receives something he's been searching for since the moment he left Corinth. A place where he no longer needs to run. And when we look backward across his life, the roads form a strange pattern. A road carried the infant away from Thebes. A road carried him toward Corinth. Another road took the young man away from the people he believed were his parents. At a crossroads, he met the father he did not recognize. A road led him to the Sphinx. Another carried him through the gates of Thebes and toward the mother he did not recognize. Later, a road carried the blind king away from everything he had possessed. And finally, after years of wandering, one last road brought him to Colonus. As a young man, Oedipus believed roads allowed people to choose their fate. Turn here instead of there. Leave this city. Avoid that person. Keep moving until destiny can no longer find you. As an old man, perhaps he understood roads differently. A road cannot promise what waits at its end. It can only carry you forward. And sometimes, the destination is not the place you spent your life trying to reach. Sometimes it is simply the first place where, after all the running, someone allows you to rest. Oedipus had finally reached the end of his wandering, but the tragedy surrounding his family had not ended with him. Because, while the blind former king found peace at Colonus, the children he left behind were still living beneath the shadow of Thebes, the throne, and a family history none of them had chosen. Antigone and Ismene had known their father not only as the once powerful king described by older citizens, but as the broken man who needed a hand beside him on unfamiliar roads. Eteocles and Polynices, meanwhile, remained connected to something Oedipus had lost long ago: political power. The throne of Thebes still existed, even when the man who once occupied it was gone, and that throne would become the center of another tragedy. According to the tradition that developed around the family of Oedipus, the brothers Eteocles and Polynices were expected to share authority, sometimes described as an agreement in which each would rule for a period before surrendering power to the other. On paper, such an arrangement might have prevented conflict. In reality, power is rarely easy to divide once someone has become accustomed to possessing it. Eteocles took control of Thebes, and when the time came for him to surrender the throne, he refused. Polynices was driven away from the city that was also his home. The pattern should already feel familiar. Another member of the family of Oedipus was now traveling away from Thebes because remaining there had become impossible. Laius had once sent his infant son away because he feared losing his life. Oedipus had once left Corinth because he feared harming the people he believed were his parents. Later, Oedipus himself had been separated from Thebes after the truth of his identity emerged. Now, Polynices left because his brother would not share the throne. Again and again, this family tried to solve problems through distance. Again and again, distance failed to erase what remained unresolved. Polynices eventually found support in Argos, where he gathered allies willing to help him reclaim Thebes. The resulting expedition became famous in Greek legend as the Seven Against Thebes, a story remembered in its own dramatic traditions. 7 leaders marched against the 7 gates of the city. For the people living behind those walls, this was not simply another distant dispute between princes. Armies were approaching because 2 brothers could not peacefully determine who should rule. The ordinary citizens of Thebes, who had once suffered beneath the Sphinx and later beneath the plague, now faced another crisis created by the royal family. The city that Oedipus had once saved was preparing for war involving his own sons. Yet before the fighting began, Polynices had already heard the warning of his father. During his visit to Oedipus at Colonus, he had asked for support and instead received a terrible prediction. The brothers would destroy one another. Antigone had begged Polynices not to continue. She knew what prophecy had done to their family. She knew how dangerous it was to hear a terrible future and continue walking directly toward the circumstances that could produce it. But Polynices believed he had been wronged. Eteocles had refused to honor their arrangement. Allies had committed themselves to his cause. Honor, pride, political obligation, and anger had gathered around him until turning back may have felt impossible. This is another recurring tragedy in the Oedipus cycle. Knowing the future does not necessarily make avoiding it easier. Sometimes people hear a warning and still cannot abandon the desires that place them in danger. The army approached Thebes. Inside the city, Eteocles prepared its defense. Outside, Polynices prepared to attack the place where he had grown up. Imagine what this meant beyond the heroic names preserved by mythology. The walls surrounding Thebes were not abstract symbols. Behind them were homes. Families waited while armed men gathered outside. People who had never argued over the throne now had to endure the consequences of those who had. Ancient stories often remember wars through leaders because leaders possess memorable names. But ordinary people experience wars through much smaller concerns. Whether a gate will hold, whether someone they love will return, whether food will remain available, whether the sounds outside are moving closer. The conflict between Eteocles and Polynices turned a family disagreement into a city's fear. Battles took place around the gates. One by one, the attacking champions encountered defenders. The expedition did not produce the simple victory Polynices hoped for. Eventually, the story narrowed toward the 2 brothers themselves. They had begun life in the same household, children of the same parents, sons of the same king, inheritors of the same complicated past. They might once have eaten at the same table, walked through the same palace, and listened to the same voices. Yet now, they stood on opposite sides of a war. The throne between them had become more important than the childhood behind them. And the prophecy Oedipus had spoken at Colonus waited quietly over the confrontation. Eteocles and Polynices met in combat. Neither brother walked away. Each killed the other. The prediction was fulfilled. The sons of Oedipus, born from the union that had fulfilled an earlier prophecy, now completed another. There is an exhausting sadness to the pattern. Laius had tried to avoid death at the hands of his son and died at his son's hands. Oedipus had tried to avoid killing his father and marrying his mother, only to do both without knowing. Polynices heard that he and Eteocles would destroy one another, yet continued toward Thebes until the brothers met in battle. Greek tragedy repeatedly returns to the uncomfortable possibility that human beings may recognize danger while remaining unable to surrender the pride, fear, anger, or ambition carrying them toward it. When the fighting ended, Thebes remained standing, but the royal family had lost both sons. Yet even death did not end the conflict. Creon now emerged as ruler of Thebes and faced the question of how the dead brothers should be treated. Eteocles had defended the city, so he would receive the honor of proper burial. Polynices had marched against Thebes with a foreign army, so Creon declared him a traitor. His body was to remain unburied. In the religious imagination of ancient Greece, burial was far more than a practical matter. Funeral rites represented respect for the dead and helped establish the proper transition away from the world of the living. To deny burial was a severe punishment, extending political judgment beyond death itself. Creon wanted the people of Thebes to understand the difference between the brother who defended the city and the brother who attacked it. But Antigone saw something more basic. Both men were her brothers. She had already watched the destruction of her parents. She had guided her blind father through exile. She had tried to persuade Polynices to abandon the war. Now he was dead, and the ruler of Thebes was telling her that she must leave his body without the rites she believed the gods required. Antigone faced a choice very different from the choices that had confronted Oedipus, yet connected to the same question that runs through the entire family story. What should a person do when human authority conflicts with something they believe is greater than human authority? Laius had tried to resist prophecy. Oedipus had tried to resist prophecy. Creon now issued a political command that Antigone believed violated unwritten divine obligations toward the dead. She decided she would not obey. Ismene was frightened. She understood her sister's love for Polynices, but she also understood the power of Creon. They had already lost almost everyone. Challenging the king could only bring another death. Ismene urged caution. Antigone refused. This difference between the sisters is important because neither response is difficult to understand. Ismene wanted to survive. After everything their family had endured, survival itself was reasonable. Antigone believed survival purchased through abandoning her brother would be unbearable. One sister feared losing the living, the other feared betraying the dead. Antigone went to Polynices and performed burial rites, despite Creon's order. The act itself was small, compared with the armies that had just fought around Thebes. She did not lead soldiers. She did not capture a gate. She did not seize the throne. She placed earth upon the body of her brother and honored him as family. Yet politically, that quiet gesture became an act of rebellion. Guards discovered that someone had performed rites for Polynices. Eventually, Antigone was caught. She did not pretend innocence. She did not claim ignorance of Creon's decree. She admitted what she had done and defended it. Creon's command, she believed, could not erase obligations older than any individual ruler. The confrontation between Creon and Antigone became one of the most enduring conflicts in ancient drama, because both characters believe they are protecting something necessary. Creon believes a city cannot survive if rulers allow open defiance, especially immediately after a civil conflict. Polynices attacked Thebes. Honoring him like its defender could appear to erase the distinction between loyalty and betrayal. Antigone believes a ruler's authority has limits. Death should end political hatred, and family and divine custom demand burial. Neither side experiences the dispute as a minor disagreement. Each believes surrender would destroy something fundamental. This is precisely why tragedy grows. If one person simply wanted something obviously foolish, compromise would be easy. Instead, two principles collide, and human pride prevents either from bending. Creon sentenced Antigone to be sealed away alive in a rocky chamber or tomb, avoiding the direct shedding of her blood while still condemning her to death. The irony is bitter. Antigone had risked everything because she refused to leave her dead brother without burial, and now she herself was being placed inside a tomb while still alive. The boundary between living and dead, already central to the dispute, became part of her punishment. But Antigone was not alone in being affected. She was promised in marriage to Haemon, Creon's son. Haemon loved her and attempted to persuade his father to reconsider. He approached carefully at first, showing respect while warning that the citizens sympathized with Antigone. Creon heard not wisdom, but challenge. The argument between father and son became another echo of the family conflict surrounding Oedipus. Once again, an older ruler believed authority required firmness. Once again, a younger person confronted that authority. Once again, pride narrowed the space in which reconciliation might have occurred. Haemon warned his father that refusing to bend could destroy what he was trying to protect. Creon did not listen soon enough. Then Tiresias returned. The blind prophet who had once stood before Oedipus now stood before Creon. Years earlier, Tiresias had tried to tell Oedipus a truth the king did not want to hear. Now he warned Creon that the gods rejected the treatment of Polynices, and that the king's decisions had created religious pollution. The pattern repeated almost perfectly. A ruler possessed power. A blind prophet delivered an unwanted warning. The ruler initially responded with suspicion and anger, but Creon eventually became frightened. Unlike Oedipus, who continued investigating until the truth destroyed his life, Creon finally decided to reverse his course. He would bury Polynices and free Antigone. For one brief moment, it seemed tragedy might be prevented. Creon had changed his mind. The decree could be undone. Antigone could return. Haemon could be reunited with her. The city could move forward. But tragedy often depends not only upon wrong decisions, but upon decisions corrected too late. Creon went first, to ensure that Polynices received proper burial. Then he hurried toward the place where Antigone had been confined. When he arrived, the opportunity had already disappeared. Antigone had taken her own life. Haemon was there with her. Grief turned toward rage and despair. He attempted to strike his father, and then died by his own hand. Creon returned, carrying the consequences of the command he had once defended so confidently. But another loss waited. When Creon's wife, Eurydice, learned that her son Haemon was dead, she too took her own life, cursing Creon for the decisions that had led to their son's death. The ruler who had insisted that the security of Thebes required absolute obedience now found himself surrounded by the destruction of his own household. He remained alive, which in Greek tragedy can sometimes be a harsher ending than death. The dead no longer have to reconsider their choices. Creon had to continue, knowing that he had been warned, that he eventually understood the warning, and that understanding arrived too late. By this point, almost every member of Oedipus's immediate family had been consumed by the consequences of secrets, prophecy, pride, political power, or loyalty. Laius died at the crossroads. Jocasta died after learning the truth. Oedipus lost his sight, throne, and home before eventually finding rest at Colonus. Eteocles and Polynices killed one another. Antigone died because she refused to abandon Polynices even after his death. Ismene remained, one of the few members of the household not destroyed within the central tragedies. It would be easy to call all of this simply a family curse, and ancient audiences certainly understood the House of Oedipus within a larger mythological tradition of inherited suffering. But the stories repeatedly show something more human than a magical curse operating mechanically. At almost every stage, there is a decision. Laius hears a prophecy and chooses fear. The infant is sent away. The shepherd chooses mercy. Polybus and Merope choose secrecy. Oedipus hears another prophecy and chooses exile. At the crossroads, anger becomes violence. Oedipus reaches Thebes and unknowingly marries Jocasta. Years later, he chooses to pursue the truth, even when people beg him to stop. Eteocles chooses not to surrender power. Polynices chooses war rather than abandoning his claim. Creon chooses to deny burial. Antigone chooses to defy him. Creon eventually chooses mercy, but too late. Fate surrounds these people, but human choices fill the space inside it. That combination is what makes the story feel so unsettling. If everything were controlled completely by fate, nobody's decisions would matter. If everything were controlled completely by choice, the prophecies would lose their terrifying power. Instead, the myth places people between the two. They choose, but they choose inside circumstances they did not create. They inherit consequences from decisions made before them. They attempt to protect themselves and sometimes create the danger they fear. They learn the truth and discover that truth cannot always repair the past. And through all of this, the city of Thebes remains. Kings come and go. The Sphinx appears and disappears. Plague arrives and eventually passes. Armies gather at the gates. Royal families destroy themselves. Yet beyond the palace walls, ordinary life continues whenever it can. Farmers return to fields after armies leave. Merchants eventually use the roads again. Children who know little about prophecies grow into adults. Buildings damaged by conflict are repaired. The people who once gathered before Oedipus begging him to save them eventually belong to an older generation. And new citizens hear stories about the strange king who solved the Sphinx's riddle. This may be one of the quietest truths hidden beneath heroic mythology. Individuals experience their lives as enormous because, to them, they are. Oedipus's discovery ended the world as he understood it. Antigone's decision cost her everything. Creon's loss transformed his remaining life. But cities continue, generations pass. The road where Laius died remains a road after nobody alive remembers the sound of the argument. Mount Cithaeron remains a mountain long after the abandoned infant becomes a legend. The places stay while human stories move through them, and perhaps, many years later, a traveller approaching Thebes might hear the story from someone sitting beside a fire. Might hear about a baby whose parents feared a prophecy, a prince who grew up in the wrong kingdom, a stranger who killed an older man at a crossroads, a clever traveller who answered the Sphinx, A king who searched for a murderer without knowing he was searching for himself. A daughter who guided her blind father through exile. Two brothers who destroyed each other over a throne, and a young woman who believed even an enemy of the city deserved burial because he remained her brother. The traveller might ask which part of the story was the true beginning. Was it the prophecy? Was it Laius's fear? Was it the shepherd's mercy? Was it Oedipus leaving Corinth? Perhaps there is no single answer. Every ending in this family becomes the beginning of something else. Laius tried to end the prophecy by abandoning his child, and that became the beginning of Oedipus's life in Corinth. Oedipus tried to end the prophecy by leaving Corinth, and that became the beginning of his road toward Thebes. His discovery ended his reign and began his wandering. His sons' struggle ended their lives and began Antigone's conflict with Creon. The story keeps moving because consequences keep moving. Yet somewhere at Colonus, away from the throne and the walls of Thebes, Oedipus himself no longer had to carry those consequences forward. His sons made their choices. Antigone made hers. Creon made his. The old king had finally reached the one place where no new road waited for him. After a lifetime shaped by people trying to control tomorrow, Oedipus had reached an ending where tomorrow no longer required his answer. The man who once defeated a creature by solving the riddle of human life had finally completed every stage contained within that riddle. He had crawled as an infant with wounded feet. He had stood upon two legs as a proud young man. He had travelled in blindness dependent upon the guidance of another, his steps slowed by age and suffering. The answer he once gave the Sphinx had quietly become his own biography. Morning, noon, and evening. Childhood, adulthood, old age. 4 limbs. 2, then support for the final journey. The Sphinx had asked Oedipus what creature changes as time passes, and he answered, man. Perhaps he did not yet understand the deepest meaning of his answer. Human beings change. The confident become uncertain. The powerful become dependent. Children become parents. Kings become wanderers. People spend years trying to control the shape of their lives, only to discover that time changes every identity they thought permanent. And still, they continue walking, until eventually the road becomes quiet. Long after the roads of Thebes had grown quiet again, after the Sphinx had become a creature of memory, after the palace had passed into other hands, and after the people who had personally known Oedipus had begun to disappear, his story remained, because it contained something larger than the tragedy of one ancient king. Oedipus had spent almost his entire life trying to escape something he could not see, and perhaps that is what makes his story feel strangely human. Even thousands of years later, he was born beneath a prophecy he did not hear, punished for a future he had not created, carried away from his first home before he could remember it, and raised by people who loved him but did not tell him where he truly came from. When he finally heard the prophecy for himself, he did not respond with cruelty or selfishness. He responded by leaving everything he loved. He believed Polybus was his father. He believed Merope was his mother. And because he could not bear the possibility of harming them, he walked away from Corinth knowing that he might never return. That decision is worth remembering, because Oedipus is often reduced to the terrible acts associated with his name, the man who killed his father and married his mother. Yet those words alone remove the most important part of the tragedy. Oedipus did not know. He spent years deliberately trying to ensure that neither event could ever happen. His journey toward disaster began as an attempt to protect the people he believed were his parents. And that is why the story is not simply about punishment. It is about the limits of human knowledge. Oedipus could make decisions only from the information available to him, and the most important information had been hidden before he was old enough to ask for it. He could choose where to travel, but he could not choose correctly when he did not know where he had begun. He could avoid Polybus, but Polybus was not the father named by the oracle. He could remain far from Merope, but Merope was not the mother named by the oracle. He could look directly at Laius on the road and see only an arrogant stranger, because nobody had ever shown him the face of his biological father. He could stand before Jocasta and see only the widowed queen of Thebes, because he had no memory of the woman who had given birth to him. Again and again, Oedipus looked directly at the truth without possessing the knowledge required to recognize it. This is why sight and blindness appear so often throughout his story. Tiresias could not see the physical world, yet understood the reality surrounding Oedipus. Oedipus could see perfectly, yet remained unable to recognize the people closest to him. Only when he finally understood everything did he destroy his own sight. Then, years later, the blind Oedipus became perhaps more capable of understanding himself than the sighted king had ever been. As a young man, he believed intelligence meant finding answers. As an old man, he had learned that answers do not always provide control. Sometimes, knowing simply means understanding what cannot be changed. There is another reason the story survives. Almost everyone within it is trying, in some way, to make tomorrow safer. Laius hears that his son will kill him, so he tries to prevent the child from growing up. Jocasta participates because she fears the same prophecy. The shepherd saves the baby because he cannot bring himself to kill him, perhaps hoping that distance will solve what cruelty cannot. Polybus and Merope raise Oedipus and conceal his origins, perhaps believing the secret will protect the family they have created. Oedipus leaves Corinth because he wants to protect them. The people of Thebes make him king because they want stability after the death of Laius and the terror of the Sphinx. Oedipus investigates Laius's murder because he wants to save Thebes from plague. Even Jocasta's desperate request that he stop investigating comes from the knowledge that another answer will bring only suffering. Everyone is trying to protect something, yet protection, without understanding repeatedly, becomes destruction. Laius tries to protect himself and creates a son who cannot recognize him. Oedipus tries to protect his parents and travels toward his biological father. Jocasta tries to protect Oedipus from the truth, but by then, the investigation cannot be stopped. Creon later tries to protect the authority of Thebes and destroys his own household through a punishment he believes necessary. Eteocles tries to protect his possession of the throne. Polynices tries to recover what he believes is rightfully his. Their competing attempts end with both brothers dead. Perhaps this is why Greek tragedy so rarely divides people neatly into heroes and villains. Human beings can cause terrible harm while believing they are preventing something worse. Good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. Fear can disguise itself as caution. Pride can disguise itself as duty. Anger can feel like justice while it is happening. And once consequences begin moving, they can travel far beyond the person who made the original choice. Consider how small some of the crucial moments in Oedipus's story really were. A servant decided not to abandon a baby completely. A child was passed from one shepherd to another. A drunken man questioned a young prince's parentage. Oedipus decided to visit Delphi. Two travelers refused to yield at a narrow crossroads. A riddle received the correct answer. A surviving servant asked to leave the palace. A messenger traveled from Corinth carrying news of an old king's death. None of these moments looks large enough by itself to create one of the most famous tragedies in literature, yet human lives often change through small events whose importance becomes visible only afterward. At the time, a crossroads is simply a crossroads. Years later, it becomes the place where everything changed. Oedipus himself spent much of his life interpreting events only after they had already happened. When he left Corinth, he believed he was escaping fate. Only later did he understand that the journey had carried him toward it. When he killed Laius, he believed he had survived a violent dispute with strangers. Only later did he understand that he had fulfilled part of the prophecy. When he solved the Sphinx's riddle, he believed he had earned a new beginning. Only later did he understand that the reward placed him beside Jocasta. When he investigated the plague, he believed he was searching for another man's crime. Only later did he understand that every question was leading toward himself. There is something almost dreamlike about this pattern. A person walks forward through events while their meaning remains hidden behind them. Only when they turn around do the scattered moments form a path. Perhaps that is why the crossroads became such a powerful symbol in later interpretations of Oedipus. We imagine a crossroads as a place of choice. One road goes left, another goes right. Choose correctly, and life becomes one thing. Choose differently, and life becomes another. But Oedipus's crossroads is unsettling because the most important choice may have been made long before he arrived there. He did not know who the older traveller was. Laius did not know who the younger traveller was. Both men entered the meeting carrying histories the other could not see. The road offered a choice about behaviour, certainly. Either man could have allowed the other to pass. Oedipus could have controlled his anger. Laius could have controlled his authority. Human responsibility remains present, but neither could choose based upon the truth, because neither recognized it. And perhaps that is closer to ordinary life than we would like to admit. People make important decisions without knowing everything. They choose careers without knowing where those careers will lead. They trust people without knowing how relationships will change. They leave homes believing they will return soon, and sometimes discover that they never truly return at all. They worry about futures that never arrive and overlook changes already happening around them. Unlike Oedipus, most people do not live beneath dramatic prophecies delivered by Apollo, but everyone lives with incomplete knowledge. We walk forward because there is no other direction available. Oedipus's tragedy exaggerates that ordinary condition until it becomes impossible to ignore. Yet his final years suggest something gentler. Once Oedipus reached Colonus, he was no longer trying to reconstruct the past or control the future. He knew who his parents were. He knew what happened at the crossroads. He knew why Jocasta had reacted with terror during the investigation. He knew why the shepherd had resisted answering. There were no more central mysteries left to solve. For most of his life, knowledge arrived too late. At Colonus, perhaps knowledge finally became something he could simply carry. He could not repair what happened, but he could stop running from it. The distinction matters. Acceptance does not mean believing that suffering was good. It does not mean pretending mistakes did not matter. It means recognizing that the past cannot be negotiated with. Oedipus could spend another 1,000 journeys wishing he had stepped aside at the crossroads, but Laius would remain dead. He could wish that he had never entered Thebes, but his children would continue to exist. He could wish that Laius and Jocasta had raised him openly, but his childhood in Corinth had already happened. The older Oedipus therefore faced a problem no intelligence could solve. How to live in a world after the answer is known. Antigone helped him do that. Her presence is perhaps one of the softest elements in a story, dominated by prophecy and death. She could not restore his sight. She could not return his throne. She could not make Jocasta live again or untangle their family history. She could simply walk beside him. Sometimes that is the only form of help still possible. When a problem cannot be solved, companionship remains. When a road cannot be shortened, someone can share it. When the past cannot be changed, another person can make the present less lonely. Oedipus, who had once tried to solve everything himself, ended his life depending upon that simple truth. And then, at Colonus, even the dependence gradually came to an end. The wandering man found sanctuary. Theseus listened to him without demanding that he become someone else. Oedipus no longer needed to hide his story because everyone important already knew it. There would be no messenger arriving tomorrow to reveal another parent, no shepherd waiting outside with another secret, no prophet whose words would suddenly transform his identity. Oedipus had finally reached a place where the truth was complete. That completeness did not make his life happy, but it made rest possible. Perhaps this is the final transformation of the man who solved the Sphinx. When he was young, Oedipus answered the riddle by explaining how a human being changes over a lifetime. An infant moves upon 4 limbs. An adult stands upon 2. An older person may depend upon a 3rd support. Oedipus gave the correct answer almost immediately, but he had lived only part of it. He understood the riddle intellectually before he understood it personally. Years later, the proud man walking confidently upon 2 legs became the older blind wanderer who required support. The answer moved from language into experience. Human beings change. Strength changes. Identity changes. The body changes. The things that seem permanent during one stage of life become memories during another. Oedipus had once been an abandoned baby, whose survival depended upon a shepherd's mercy. Then he became a prince who believed the world of Corinth belonged to him. Then a traveller, frightened by prophecy. Then a violent stranger at a crossroads. Then the brilliant solver of a riddle. Then a king. Then a husband and father. Then a man searching for a murderer. Then the murderer he sought. Then a blind exile. Then an old man guided by his daughter. No single description contained all of him. Perhaps that is another reason his story remains larger than the shocking revelation at its center. Human beings are not only the worst thing they have done, the greatest thing they have achieved, the family into which they were born, or the title they once possessed. Oedipus was the man who killed Laius, but he was also the man who saved Thebes from the Sphinx. He was the man who married Jocasta, but also the man who had no idea she was his mother. He was a king who became an exile, a confident man who became dependent, and a person crushed by truth who eventually learned to speak about his own life with greater understanding. None of those identities cancels the others. They remain together because a human life is rarely simple enough to become one sentence. And perhaps the people of ancient Greece understood this when they continued telling his story. They did not preserve Oedipus because his life offered a comfortable moral lesson. It does not. If the lesson were simply, do not try to escape fate, then Oedipus would be little more than an example. If it were simply, control your temper, much of the prophecy would become unnecessary. If it were simply, always seek truth, the terrible consequences of discovering truth would complicate the message. The story survives precisely because it refuses to become that easy. It asks whether people are responsible for actions they commit without knowing their true meaning. It asks whether knowing the future helps us or traps us. It asks whether parents can create the very dangers they are trying to prevent. It asks whether truth is always worth pursuing. It asks whether suffering can change a person without completely destroying them. And then it leaves those questions with us, rather than answering every one. Thousands of years later, we still know the name Oedipus. The walls of the ancient Thebes he supposedly ruled belong to archaeology and legend. The roads have changed. The people who first listened to versions of the myth disappeared long ago. Sophocles himself died more than 2,000 years before any of us were born. Yet somewhere tonight, someone can still hear about a frightened king named Laius receiving a prophecy. They can still imagine the baby carried toward Mount Cithaeron. They can still follow the young prince leaving Corinth because he loves the people he believes are his parents. They can still see two strangers approaching one another at a narrow crossroads. They can still hear the Sphinx asking her strange question. They can still watch Oedipus enter Thebes, believing he has escaped his destiny. And even though we know what is coming, some part of us still wishes he would notice. Turn around. Ask another question. Do not fight the stranger. Do not accept the throne. Listen to Tiresias. Stop when Jocasta asks you to stop. But he cannot hear us. The story has already happened. The words have travelled across centuries precisely because Oedipus continues walking toward the truth every time the story is told. Yet if there is any peace within the tragedy, it waits not at the beginning and not inside the palace, but at the end of the road. An old blind man reaches Colonus. His running is finished. His questions are finished. He no longer needs to defeat prophecy, because there is no prophecy left to escape. He no longer needs to discover who he is, because he finally knows. The daughter who guided him remains nearby. A king offers him sanctuary, the landscape is quiet, and after a lifetime in which every road seemed to carry him toward another terrible revelation, Oedipus finally reaches a place where nothing more is required of him. The child who was never supposed to survive has grown old. The king who once possessed everything has learned to live without a crown. The man who spent his life searching for answers has reached the end of questions. And for the first time since he left Corinth so many years before, Oedipus does not need to choose another road. He can simply rest. Perhaps the strangest thing about the story of Oedipus is that, after everything we have followed, the prophecy itself was actually quite short. A son would kill his father and marry his mother. Those few words were enough to shape an entire lifetime, but the lifetime was far larger than the prophecy. It contained a frightened king, a mother facing an impossible decision, a shepherd who could not abandon a baby to death, another family willing to raise that child as their own, a young prince leaving everything familiar because he believed distance could protect the people he loved, an argument on a lonely road, a mysterious creature outside the walls of Thebes, a riddle answered correctly, a kingdom saved, a marriage celebrated, children born, years of ordinary royal life, a city struck by plague, an investigation that slowly turned toward the investigator himself, an old shepherd forced to reveal what he had hidden, a queen who understood the truth moments before her husband did, a king who lost his sight after finally learning to see, and eventually an old man walking slowly beside his daughter toward the place where his long journey would finally end. The prophecy tells us what happened, but it does not tell us what it felt like to live through all the years between those events. And perhaps this is why Oedipus became more than simply a warning about fate. If we look only at the prophecy, his life seems almost mechanical, as though the gods announced an ending, and human beings simply moved toward it. But when we look closely at the road itself, we find fear, love, anger, compassion, pride, loyalty, uncertainty, and countless decisions made by people who could never see the entire picture. Laius did not hold his newborn son and think of himself as the beginning of a famous tragedy. He thought about survival, Jocasta did not send the child away knowing she would meet him again as an adult. She believed she was preventing the destruction of her family. The shepherd who spared Oedipus could not know that his mercy would eventually return the child to Thebes. Polybus and Merope could not know that concealing Oedipus's adoption would cause him to misunderstand the oracle. Oedipus did not leave Corinth because he wanted adventure, glory, or a throne. He left because he was frightened of hurting the people he loved. None of them could see the story the way we see it now. We stand outside it, with the beginning and ending placed together. They had to live inside it, one day at a time. And that difference matters, because it is easy to judge decisions when we already know where they lead. At the crossroads, we know the older man is Laius. Oedipus does not. When Oedipus meets Jocasta, we know she is his mother. Neither of them does. When Tiresias refuses to speak, we know his silence is meant to protect Oedipus from unbearable knowledge. Oedipus sees only a prophet withholding information while citizens are dying. When Jocasta begs him to stop investigating, we understand why. Oedipus believes she may simply be ashamed of discovering that her husband came from an ordinary family. We know the answer before the person asking the question, and that creates the particular sadness of the story. We watch a man move toward a door while knowing what waits behind it. We want to warn him, but the distance between storyteller and character cannot be crossed. The story continues. The door opens. The truth remains the truth. Yet perhaps the most important part of Oedipus's life begins after that door has opened, because once everything was known, fate no longer had anything left to threaten him with. Think about the young Oedipus leaving Delphi. He was terrified of tomorrow. Somewhere in the future, he believed, waited a moment when he would kill Polybus, and another when he would marry Merope. Every mile away from Corinth was an attempt to create distance between himself and those imagined events. The future felt dangerous because it contained possibilities he desperately wanted to control. The older Oedipus at Colonus was almost the opposite. His greatest disasters were behind him. He could no longer prevent them, but neither could he continue fearing that they might happen. Laius had already died. Jocasta had already died. The truth of his birth was already known. His throne was gone. His sight was gone. The frightening unknown had become a painful known, and painful knowledge eventually gave Oedipus something fear never could. Stillness. There was no longer any reason to run. Perhaps that is why his arrival at Colonus feels so peaceful compared with the rest of the story. Oedipus began life being carried away from the place where he belonged. He spent adulthood traveling because he believed he could choose a place where fate could not reach him. He spent his later years wandering because the place he had ruled could no longer remain his home. Home, for Oedipus, was almost always somewhere unstable. Thebes was the city of his birth, but rejected him as an infant. Corinth was the city of his childhood, but depended upon a secret. Thebes welcomed him back without knowing who he was, then became the place from which he had to leave after discovering the truth. Colonus was different. Nobody there needed to pretend Oedipus was someone else. Theseus knew he was the fallen king of Thebes. Antigone knew everything. Oedipus himself knew everything. Acceptance arrived only when there was nothing left to hide. That may be the quietest victory in the entire myth. Oedipus never defeated fate. He never restored his old life. He never received a magical explanation proving that the prophecy had been misunderstood. He did something less spectacular and perhaps more difficult. He reached a point where he no longer needed the past to become different before he could stop moving. For a man whose entire life had been shaped by attempts to prevent what had been foretold, simply accepting the road behind him represented an enormous change. And if we return one final time to the Sphinx, we find that the creature's famous riddle had been telling us something about Oedipus long before he understood it. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening? A human being. The infant crawls. The adult walks upright. The elderly person uses support. Oedipus answered correctly because he understood the pattern of a human lifetime, but his own life would eventually turn the answer into something deeply personal. As a baby, his feet were wounded, and his survival depended entirely upon other people carrying him. As a young man, he walked confidently on his own, so confident that at a crossroads he refused to yield. As king, he stood before Thebes, believing his intelligence could solve whatever threatened the city. Then, age, blindness, and suffering changed the way he moved through the world. He required Antigone's hand. His steps became slower. The man who once trusted only his own direction learned to be guided. Morning became noon. Noon became evening. The answer to the Sphinx was never simply man. The answer was change. No human being remains what they once were. The helpless child becomes independent. The confident adult eventually discovers limits. The ruler becomes someone who needs help. The person who once guided others may one day need another person's hand. Titles disappear. Bodies change. Homes change. Families change. Even the stories we tell about ourselves can change when we learn something new about the past. Oedipus thought he knew exactly who he was, until a few conversations transformed the meaning of his entire life. Yet beneath all those transformations, something continued. The infant abandoned on Cytheron, the prince of Corinth, the traveller at the crossroads, the solver of the Sphinx, the king of Thebes, the husband of Jocasta, the father of Antigone, the blind exile, and the old man at Colonus were all the same human being moving through different stages of one life. Perhaps this is why the ancient story refuses to disappear. We may never receive an oracle from Delphi. We may never encounter a Sphinx. Most of us will never sit upon a throne or discover a secret as terrible as the one Oedipus uncovered. But everyone understands what it means to make decisions without knowing what will happen next. Everyone understands looking backward and wishing some moment had gone differently. Everyone understands that there are things about the past which cannot be changed no matter how often they are remembered. And almost everyone, given enough years, discovers that the person they once were can begin to feel like someone from another story. Oedipus makes those ordinary experiences enormous enough for us to see them clearly. His mistake was not simply that he tried to escape fate. His deeper tragedy was believing that enough knowledge and enough determination could give him complete control over a life built from circumstances he did not choose. He could control some things. He could choose to leave Corinth. He could choose how to behave at the crossroads. And there his anger had terrible consequences. He could choose to solve the Sphinx's riddle. He could choose to investigate Laius's death. But he could not choose who his biological parents were. He could not choose what Laius had done to him as an infant. He could not choose what Polybus and Merope had concealed. Human freedom existed, but it existed inside boundaries. Oedipus's suffering came partly from discovering those boundaries only after crossing them. And still, the story does not end by telling us that human choice is meaningless. If choice meant nothing, the shepherd's mercy would mean nothing. Antigone's devotion would mean nothing. Theseus offering sanctuary would mean nothing. Yet those choices mattered enormously. The shepherd could not erase the prophecy, but he could refuse to kill a baby. Antigone could not restore her father's past, but she could make sure he did not walk alone. Theseus could not undo what happened in Thebes, but he could give an exhausted man somewhere to rest. Perhaps we cannot control the entire shape of a life, the myth seems to whisper, but we can still decide how we treat the person standing beside us. That may be the gentlest lesson hidden inside such a dark story. Oedipus's life was changed by enormous forces' prophecy, kingship, plague, war, family secrets. But it was also changed by simple acts between individuals. A shepherd looked at an infant and chose compassion. Adoptive parents gave that child a home. A daughter stayed beside a disgraced father when staying offered her no reward. A foreign king listened to an exile and allowed him sanctuary. Fate may determine the great shape of the myth, but kindness fills some of its quietest spaces. Without those moments, Oedipus's story would contain only punishment. Because of them, it also contains survival. And so perhaps we should not leave Oedipus standing inside the palace at the moment his world collapsed. That is the image most people remember. The king who finally discovered the truth and could no longer bear to see. But his life continued beyond that moment. Let us leave him instead, many years later, when the anger of the crossroads has faded into memory and the throne of Thebes is far behind him. The evening air around Colonus is quiet. Olive trees move gently in the breeze. The road that carried Oedipus through so many stages of his life has nearly reached its end. Antigone is nearby. Theseus has promised him protection. Nobody is asking him another riddle. Nobody is demanding that he solve another murder. No messenger is arriving with another secret. No oracle is sending him toward another escape. For perhaps the first time in his life, there is nothing Oedipus needs to discover before tomorrow. He knows where he came from. He knows what he did. He knows what was done to him. He knows the limits of what can be repaired. And somehow, after all those years, knowing is finally enough. The young Oedipus once believed peace existed somewhere far enough away from fate. The old Oedipus discovered something different. Peace did not come from finding the perfect road. It came when he no longer needed another road at all. And somewhere near Colonus, beneath the quiet evening sky, the man who spent his entire life trying to outrun his destiny finally stopped running.